The morning of October 12th, 2024 arrived over central Nebraska with the kind of light that makes a farmer remember why he stays. Gold and horizontal and final, the way November light would be in another few weeks. Except this was still October, and the corn was standing at precisely the moment it should be harvested, and the weather forecast promised 6 clear days before the system moved in from the west. Ray Holloway sat in the cab of his John Deere S780 combine at 6:52 in the morning with his hand on the header controls and his eyes on the yield monitor, and his mind on the conversation he was having with a woman who had been dead for 5 years. The passenger seat beside him was empty. It had been empty every harvest since 2019, but Ray still glanced at it, the way a man glances at a photograph he has looked at so many times he no longer sees the frame. Anna had sat there for 26 harvests before the cancer took her, riding along in the early mornings when the dew was still on the corn, and the cab was quiet except for the diesel engine and the sound of the header cutting through the rows. She would bring coffee in a thermos and sit with her hands wrapped around the cup, and say very little because Anna had understood that a man harvesting his crop needed silence more than conversation, needed the rhythm of the work to settle his mind for the day ahead. Ray whispered the words without moving his lips, the way he had whispered them every morning of every harvest since she died. Good yield this year, Anna. 198 bushels per acre. You would say I worried for nothing. The voice that answered him came from the part of his mind that still carried her intact, the part that had memorized the exact cadence of her speech and the particular way she had of making a statement sound like both comfort and challenge. I am always saying that, Ray. You worry too much, and it never changes a thing. He smiled without quite meaning to, a reflex born from years of her being right about nearly everything. The yield monitor climbed as he worked the next section. 200 bushels, 201. And the corn moved through the combine with the steady efficiency of machinery that had been maintained properly and run carefully and never asked to do more than it was designed to do. Ray had paid $320,000 for this machine 4 years ago, financed it with a loan that would be paid off completely after next season. $42,000 remained on the principal. This harvest, if the numbers held, would generate just enough profit to make next year's payment and have something left over for the property taxes that came due every December and the seed and fertilizer costs that every farmer carried from one season to the next. The farm would be clear then, almost clear. No debt on the land, no debt on the house, only the equipment loan that was manageable and predictable and would be finished in 12 more months. Ray's grandfather Jonas had bought this ground in 1952, 640 acres of black Nebraska soil that had produced corn and soybeans for 72 years without missing a harvest. His father had paid off the mortgage in 1986, 2 years before the farm crisis that took half the county. Ray had inherited it debt-free in 2008 and had kept it that way except for the equipment loans, and even those he had managed conservatively, buying used when he could and financing only what he absolutely needed to keep farming. Ray was 57 years old and had been farming since he was 16, working alongside his father every season until the old man died in 2007 and passed the operation to his son. 41 years of planting and harvesting, of watching weather and markets, of making decisions that meant the difference between profit and loss. Anna had made him promise to continue. Sitting in the hospital bed with her hand in his and her voice already thin from the pain medication, she had looked at him with eyes that still held all the fierceness she had brought to 32 years of marriage, and said the words he replayed in his mind every time a dealer tried to sell him something new and shiny and mortgaged to the hilt. Keep farming, Ray. Don't let them turn this into suburbs. Their daughter Emma had been standing in the doorway that day, 31 years old and watching her mother die, and trying to be strong about it in the way children try to be strong when their parents are breaking in front of them. Later, after the funeral, after the neighbors had brought enough casseroles to fill the freezer, and then stopped coming because grief makes people uncomfortable, and eventually everyone runs out of things to say, Emma had sat at the kitchen table and suggested something different. Not selling, not exactly, but maybe leasing some ground to the corporate operations that were consolidating farms across the county. Dad, you could lease 400 acres and just work the home section. Less stress, more time. You could still be farming. Ray had looked at his daughter across the table, seeing Anna's eyes in her face and Anna's stubbornness in the set of her jaw, and said the only thing he could say. Your mother told me to keep farming. That means all of it. Emma had not brought it up again. Now Ray guided the combine through the corn, watching the rows disappear into the header, and feeling the particular satisfaction of a man whose gamble with seed and soil and weather has landed exactly where he needed it to land. The standing corn represented 320 acres still to be harvested. At 198 bushels per acre and $4.30 per bushel, the math worked out to just under $270,000 gross. Subtract the seed cost, the fertilizer, the fuel, the maintenance, the property taxes, the crop insurance, and what remained would be exactly enough to make the payment on the combine and maybe have a little left over for the equipment repairs that always came due in the winter. 7:43 in the morning, the sun climbing higher, the dew burned off the corn and the header running clean, and the whole day spreading out ahead of him like a promise. The yield monitor held steady at 198. Ray allowed himself a moment of satisfaction that felt almost like pride. This corn had come from seed he had saved from last year's harvest, selected from the best ears in the highest yielding sections of the field. It was a practice his grandfather Jonas had taught him when Ray was 12 years old, standing in the machine shed on a January afternoon with the wind howling outside, and the stored corn sorted into bushels based on quality. Always save your best seed, Ray. That is how we survived the Dust Bowl. That is how we survived '88. That is how we survive every bad year. Good seed is insurance. Jonas Holloway had been a man of few words and strong convictions, and the conviction about seed saving had been among his strongest. He had kept a leather-bound ledger documenting every season's saved seed since 1952, recording which varieties performed best in which conditions, which genetics seemed to handle drought or excess moisture or late frost. The ledger was somewhere in the barn, Ray knew, tucked away with other remnants of his grandfather's methodical approach to farming. Ray had not looked at it in years, had not needed to because the practice of seed saving had become second nature, something he did without thinking about it the same way he checked the oil before starting the combine or tested the soil before applying fertilizer. This year's corn was from seed saved in 2023, which had been saved from seed Ray purchased from Genesis AgroSciences in 2022. The Genesis seed had been good, a hybrid variety called GS4477 that the dealer had recommended for its drought tolerance and high yield potential. Ray had planted it across all 640 acres, and the results had been excellent, 192 bushels per acre, even in a year when rainfall had been below average. So he had saved 200 bushels of the best corn, stored it properly in the climate-controlled section of the grain bin, and planted it this spring. The corn growing now, the corn being harvested this October morning, was the offspring of that saved seed, and the yield monitor showing 198 bushels per acre suggested that the practice his grandfather had taught him still worked exactly as intended. Ray was thinking about this, about the continuity of knowledge passed from Jonas to his father to himself, when he noticed the white van. It appeared first as a reflection in his side mirror, a vehicle moving slowly along the gravel road that bordered his South 40. White paint, no visible markings from this distance, driving at maybe 15 miles per hour. Too slow for someone just passing through. Too deliberate for someone lost. Ray watched the van in the mirror as he continued to harvest, his attention divided between the corn ahead of him and the vehicle behind. The van reached the corner of his field and stopped. Two men got out. They were dressed identically in khaki pants and green polo shirts, and even from 300 yards away Ray could see the deliberate professionalism in the way they moved. One of them walked to the back of the van and retrieved something from the cargo area. A metal case of some kind, rectangular and substantial. The other man stood at the edge of the field with what looked like a clipboard or tablet in his hands. Ray felt something tighten in his chest, not quite alarm but not quite curiosity either. Something that sat between them and waited to see which direction it would go. He brought the combine to a stop and climbed down from the cab. The October morning was cool enough that his breath made small clouds in the air. The corn stubble crunched under his boots as he walked toward the two men, and the sound carried in the particular silence that exists in farm country when machinery stops running. The men saw him coming and waited. The one with the metal case set it down carefully in the stubble. The one with the tablet raised his hand in a gesture that might have been a wave or might have been something else. Ray covered the distance between them in maybe 90 seconds, walking with the steady pace of a man who is not hurried but is not wasting time either. When he got close enough to see details, he could read the embroidered logos on their polo shirts. Genesis AgroSciences, and below that, in smaller text, Seed Compliance Division. Ray stopped 10 feet away from them and said the words that needed to be said. "What the hell are you doing on my property?" The man with the tablet spoke first. He was younger, maybe 35, with a face that was trying very hard to look apologetic while maintaining professional distance. "Mr. Holloway, Raymond Holloway." Ray did not answer the question. He just stood there and waited. The man continued, "My name is David Kurtz. This is my associate Tom Reynolds. We are with Genesis AgroSciences Seed Compliance Division. We are here to conduct a routine genetic verification inspection." The words made sense individually, but assembled together they produced confusion rather than comprehension. Genetic verification inspection. Ray repeated the phrase to see if hearing it out loud would clarify what it meant. David Kurtz tapped something on his tablet and held it up so Ray could see the screen. It displayed what looked like an aerial photograph of Ray's farm, the field boundaries marked in red lines, several areas highlighted in yellow. "We are authorized under federal seed patent law to collect soil and plant samples from fields where our licensed genetics may be present. This is routine compliance verification to ensure proper licensing terms are being followed." Ray looked at the tablet and then at the metal case and then back at David Kurtz's face. "You want to take samples from my field?" "Yes, sir, just soil and plant tissue. The process takes about 15 minutes. We will provide you with documentation of what we collect and when." David Kurtz held out a piece of paper, a form printed on Genesis AgroSciences letterhead. "Sign here acknowledging sample collection. This is just verification that we were here and that you were informed of the process." Ray took the paper without signing it and read the text. It was dense with legal language, phrases like genetic licensing compliance and unauthorized propagation and patent infringement remediation. At the bottom in smaller print was a paragraph that made Ray read it 3 times to be certain he was understanding correctly. "Purchaser acknowledges that Genesis AgroSciences seed products are licensed for single-season use only. Saving, replanting, transferring, or otherwise propagating genetic material derived from Genesis products constitutes patent infringement under U.S. Code Title 35 and may result in civil and criminal penalties, including but not limited to monetary damages, injunctive relief, and seizure of crops. Ray looked up from the paper and at the two men standing in front of him. I bought your seed 2 years ago, planted it, harvested it, saved some, planted it again this year. That is what farmers do. David Kurtz's expression did not change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle tensing that suggested he had heard this objection before and knew where the conversation was going. Mr. Holloway, when you purchased Genesis seed, you agreed to our licensing terms. Those terms specify single-season use. Saving and replanting constitutes unauthorized propagation of our patented genetics. Ray felt the anger start to build, the particular rage that comes when a man realizes someone is trying to tell him that something he has done his entire life is suddenly illegal. My grandfather saved seed for 70 years. My father saved seed. I save seed. It is what you do when you farm. Tom Reynolds spoke for the first time, his voice flat and rehearsed. Agricultural practices have changed, sir. Modern seed development requires significant investment. Patent protection ensures companies can recover those costs. These are the terms you agreed to when you made your purchase. Ray looked at the paper in his hand again, at the fine print that described penalties and infringement and seizure. Show me where I agreed to this. David Kurtz tapped his tablet again and pulled up what looked like a scanned receipt. When you purchased Genesis GS 4477 seed in March 2022, this was the point of sale disclosure. The licensing terms were printed on the receipt. Ray squinted at the screen. The text was maybe 8-point font, paragraphs of legal language crammed into the bottom third of a standard receipt. He could not remember reading it. He could not remember the dealer at the co-op mentioning anything about single-season use or patent restrictions. He had bought seed, paid for it, planted it, harvested it. That was the transaction as he understood it. I want you off my property. David Kurtz nodded slowly, the gesture of a man who had anticipated this response and had a script for it. We can do this 2 ways, Mr. Holloway. You can allow us to collect samples voluntarily and sign the documentation, or we can return with a court order and county sheriff escort. Either way, the samples will be collected. Voluntary cooperation makes the process simpler for everyone. Ray stood in his cornfield on an October morning with 2 men in polo shirts, telling him they had the legal right to collect evidence that he had committed a crime by doing what his grandfather had taught him to do. The absurdity of it felt like something from a different world, from a version of reality where the rules had changed without anyone bothering to announce the change clearly. He thought about refusing. He thought about calling his lawyer, except he did not have a lawyer because in 57 years of farming he had never needed one. He thought about calling Emma, except Emma worked in intellectual property law in Omaha and would probably explain to him in careful professional language that the men were legally correct and he was legally wrong. Fine, take your samples, but I am not signing anything. David Kurtz and Tom Reynolds worked efficiently, moving through the field with the practiced coordination of people who had done this many times before. They collected soil samples from 3 different locations, digging maybe 6 inches down and placing the dirt into labeled containers. They cut tissue samples from corn plants still standing, selecting leaves and stalks and placing them into plastic bags marked with codes Ray could not decipher. They photographed everything, the field boundaries, the combine sitting idle in the middle of harvested rows, Ray himself standing with his arms crossed watching them work. The whole process took 18 minutes. When they finished, David Kurtz handed Ray a copy of their collection report. 3 soil samples, 12 plant tissue samples, GPS coordinates for each collection point. At the bottom of the form was text Ray read with growing dread. Samples will be analyzed for presence of Genesis AgroSciences patented genetic markers. Results will be available within 14 business days. If unauthorized propagation is detected, Genesis Legal Department will contact you regarding remediation. They packed their equipment back into the white van and drove away, leaving Ray standing in his field with a piece of paper that felt heavier than it should. He walked back to the combine slowly, his mind trying to organize the implications of what had just happened. The men had been polite. They had been professional. They had explained their authority. And none of that changed the fundamental fact that they had just collected evidence to prove he had committed a crime by saving seed the way farmers had saved seed for thousands of years. Ray climbed back into the cab and sat in the seat that still held the warmth from where he had been sitting 20 minutes ago. The yield monitor still showed 198 bushels per acre. The corn still waited to be harvested. But something had shifted, some certainty about the world that he had not realized he was carrying until it was gone. He sat there for a long time, long enough that the warmth left the seat, and the morning advanced into the fuller light of mid-morning. Through the windshield he could see the rows of corn stretching toward the horizon, the crop he had planted from saved seed because that was what Jonas had taught him to do, and what made economic sense, and what every farmer Ray knew had done for as long as farming existed as a profession. Eventually, he started the combine again and went back to work because the corn would not harvest itself, and the weather window would not wait for him to process what had happened. But the rhythm of the work felt different now, colored by the knowledge that someone somewhere in an office he would never see was analyzing samples collected from his field to prove that he owed them money for the crime of farming the way his grandfather had taught him. 3 days later, the letter arrived. Ray found it in the mailbox at the end of his driveway, a thick envelope with Genesis AgroSciences printed in the corner and legal department underneath. He carried it back to the farmhouse without opening it, set it on the kitchen table, and stared at it for 10 minutes before he found the courage to tear the flap. Inside were 9 pages of documents. The first was a letter on official letterhead, addressed to Raymond Holloway regarding genetic licensing violation, case number GS-NE-10472. Dear Mr. Holloway, laboratory analysis of samples collected from your property on October 15, 2024, has confirmed the presence of Genesis AgroSciences patented genetic markers in crops currently under cultivation. Specifically, genetic sequences proprietary to our GS4477 corn variety were detected in plants and soil samples, indicating unauthorized propagation of licensed material. This constitutes patent infringement under U.S. Code Title 35, Section 271. You are hereby notified that Genesis AgroSciences is pursuing civil remedies including, but not limited to monetary damages, for unauthorized use of our intellectual property. Based on documented yield data for your property and current market values, we calculate damages at $280,000 plus court costs and attorney fees. This represents the licensing fees you would have paid for authorized use of our genetics plus punitive damages for willful infringement. You have 30 days from receipt of this letter to contact our legal department to discuss settlement options. Failure to respond will result in immediate filing of civil lawsuit in federal district court. Ray read the letter 3 times. The second reading did not make it mean something different than the first. $280,000. The number sat on the page like an accusation delivered in corporate language, impersonal and final. He had paid $18,000 for the Genesis seed in 2022. He had saved approximately 200 bushels, maybe $3,000 worth at current market prices. And for that they were claiming he owed $280,000. The math made no sense. The justice of it made no sense. The idea that saving seed from a crop he had grown with his own labor on his own land could be called theft made no sense. But the letter was real. The case number was real. The 30-day deadline was real. Ray picked up his phone and called Emma because calling his daughter was the thing he did when something happened that he could not process alone. She answered on the second ring with the professional efficiency she brought to work calls during business hours. Emma Holloway. Emma, it is Dad. I need your help. Something in his voice must have carried the weight of what he was carrying, because her tone changed immediately from professional to concerned. What happened? Genesis AgroSciences is suing me for $280,000. Silence on the other end of the line. Then Dad slowed down. Tell me exactly what happened. Ray told her about the white van, the men in polo shirts, the samples collected, the letter that arrived today. He told her about saving seed from the 2023 harvest and planting it this spring. He told her about Jonah's teaching him that saving your best seed was insurance and basic farming practice. When he finished, Emma was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had taken on the careful neutrality she used when delivering news that would not be welcome. Dad, this is real. I have seen these cases in my work. Seed companies have been enforcing patent rights for 10 years now. The courts have consistently ruled in their favor. But I bought the seed. I paid for it. I grew the crop. How can they claim I do not own it? You bought a license to use their genetics for one season. You did not buy the genetics themselves. That is what the patent law says. Ray felt something break loose in his chest, some piece of the rigid control he had been maintaining since the morning the men appeared in his field. That makes no sense, Emma. My grandfather saved seed for 70 years. Every farmer I know saves seed. It is what you do. I know, Dad, but the law changed, and the contracts changed, and now saving seed is patent infringement. Ray looked out the kitchen window at the barn where Jonas had taught him to select seed on cold January afternoons. $280,000. That is more than this year's entire profit. That is more than I have in savings. They are going to take the farm. Emma's voice got quieter, more gentle. No, they are not. We are going to fight this. But Dad, I need you to do something first. What? Find every piece of paper you have about the seed you bought. Find your receipts. Find any documentation about what you were told when you purchased it. Find everything. Ray thought about the filing cabinet in the farmhouse office, the manila folders organized by year. He kept records of everything, always had, taught by his father who had been taught by Jonas that a farmer who does not document his business is a farmer who loses arguments he should win. I have records. Good, get them together. I am driving down tomorrow. We are going to figure this out. After Emma hung up, Ray sat at the kitchen table with the letter still in front of him and thought about the conversation he wished he could have with Anna. She would have known what to say. She would have had the particular clarity she brought to moments when the world stopped making sense. Instead, he had only the voice in his head that carried her memory, imperfect and incomplete, but the best he could do. What would you say, Anna? What would you tell me about men in polo shirts collecting evidence that I committed a crime by doing what your father-in-law taught me? The voice that answered was his own imagination, but it sounded enough like her that it helped. I would say get your records together. I would say call Emma. I would say do not let them make you ashamed of farming the way good farmers have always farmed. Ray stood up and walked to the farmhouse office. a small room off the kitchen that held the filing cabinet and the desk and the computer he used to manage crop insurance and commodity prices and all the digital infrastructure that modern farming required. The filing cabinet had 4 drawers, each one organized by year and category: equipment, inputs, sales, taxes. He pulled open the inputs drawer for 2022 and found the folder labeled seed. Inside were receipts from the co-op, documentation of what he had purchased, and when and how much it had cost. He found the receipt for Genesis GS4477 seed dated March 14, 2022, $18,240 for 800 bags. Ray pulled out a magnifying glass from the desk drawer and looked at the bottom of the receipt where the fine print lived. The text was maybe 6-point font, packed tight, legal language about licensing terms and restrictions. He read it slowly, forcing himself to understand each phrase. Licensed for single-season use only. Saving or replanting seed constitutes patent infringement. Violators subject to civil penalties. The words were there. They had been there when he made the purchase, buried in text so small he would have needed optical assistance to read them. The dealer at the co-op had not mentioned them. Ray had not read them. He had bought seed the way he had bought seed for 30 years, paying for bags and planting them and saving some for next season. He kept looking through the folder and found something else. A receipt from 2021, same dealer, different Genesis variety. He pulled out the magnifying glass again and looked at the fine print on that receipt. It was different, shorter. The text mentioned nothing about single-season restrictions or patent infringement. It said only that Genesis AgroSciences warrants seed quality and genetic purity. Ray laid the 2 receipts side by side on the desk and compared them. Between March 2021 and March 2022, Genesis had changed their terms. They had added the restrictions about seed saving, and they had done it in 6-point font at the bottom of a receipt that no farmer would read carefully, because no farmer had reason to believe that buying seed had become something other than buying seed. This was not about him violating terms he had agreed to. This was about terms being changed without clear notice, without explanation, without any conversation about the fact that a practice older than patent law was suddenly being called a crime. Ray took both receipts and put them in a new folder he labeled legal. Then he went back to the filing cabinet and started pulling everything else that might matter. Crop records showing yields by field and year, soil tests, insurance documentation, financial records showing what he paid for inputs and what he earned from harvest. And then he remembered Jonas's ledger. It was in the barn, he was certain, somewhere in the machine shed section where Jonas had kept his desk and his coffee pot and his hand-written records of everything that mattered. Ray had not been through that area thoroughly since his grandfather died in 2009, had left it mostly untouched as a kind of memorial to the man who had taught him how to farm. He walked out to the barn through October afternoon light that was starting to slant toward evening. The machine shed still smelled like motor oil and old wood and decades of accumulated farm work. Jonas's desk sat in the corner, a metal thing from the 1950s with drawers that stuck and a surface scarred by years of use. Ray opened the drawers one by one, finding old parts catalogs and maintenance logs and handwritten notes about soil amendments and crop rotation schedules. In the bottom drawer, underneath a stack of receipts from 1970s grain sales, he found the ledger. It was bound in leather, maybe 9 inches by 12 inches, the cover worn smooth by handling. Inside, Jonas's handwriting filled pages in the careful script of a man who believed documentation mattered. The first entry was dated March 1952. Purchased certified seed corn from Henderson Seed Company, 40 bushels, planted north 80, Yield 89 bushels per acre. Saved 12 bushels from best ears for next year. Entry after entry, year after year. Jonah's documenting what he planted, what he saved, what he learned. In 1963, there was a note about a variety that handled drought better than expected. Saved 30 bushels for replanting. This is the one that will carry us through dry years. In 1971, Jonas had written about combining two varieties to create something new. Selected best traits from both. Planted trial section. Results promising. In 1988, the year of the worst drought anyone could remember, Jonas had written in careful letters that looked more pressed into the page than written. Crop failed in most sections. Only the seed I selected for drought tolerance produced anything. Saved every bushel. This is why we save seed. Ray read through 72 years of entries, seeing his grandfather's entire farming life documented in decisions about which genetics to preserve and which to let go. This was not infringement. This was not theft. This was farming at its most fundamental level, the practice of observation and selection and preservation that had fed humanity since agriculture began. He took the ledger back to the farmhouse and added it to the legal folder. If Genesis wanted to claim that seed saving was a crime, they would have to explain how a practice documented across 7 decades by a man who had never been sued or fined or accused of anything was suddenly illegal. That night Ray could not sleep. He lay in the bed he had shared with Anna, looking at the ceiling and thinking about the 30-day deadline and the $280,000 claim, and the certainty that was slipping away with every hour that passed. At 11:43, his phone rang with a number he recognized. Frank Dietrich, neighbor to the north, farmer who ran 800 acres of corn and soybeans with the same conservative approach Ray brought to his own operation. Ray answered and Frank's voice came through rough and strained. "Ray, did you get a letter from Genesis?" Ray sat up in bed, something cold moving through his chest. "Yeah, today, 280,000. Jesus, mine says 340. They are saying I saved seed from 2022 and planted it in 2024. They tested my fields in September." "Frank, what is happening?" Frank was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a man who has just understood something terrible. "They are coming after all of us, every farmer who saved seed. I talked to Dutch McKenna an hour ago. He got a letter too, 420,000. Ray felt the room tilt around him. "How many?" "I do not know, but Ray, this is not random. This is systematic. They are targeting everyone who saved seed." The two men sat in silence on opposite ends of a phone connection, both of them trying to process what they were learning. Finally, Ray said the thing that needed to be said. "We need to talk to everyone. We need to find out how big this is." Frank agreed. "Tomorrow night, my barn spread the word." After Frank hung up, Ray sat in the dark bedroom and thought about Genesis AgroSciences and white vans and DNA testing and legal letters, claiming that farming the way Jonas had taught him was worth $280,000 in penalties. He thought about Anna and the promise he had made to keep farming. He thought about Emma driving down from Omaha tomorrow to help him fight something neither of them fully understood yet. He thought about Jonas's ledger documenting 72 years of seed selection, every entry proof that what he had done was not crime but craft. Somewhere in an office he would never see, people were making decisions about his life based on genetic sequences and patent law and profit margins. They were reaching into his field from hundreds of miles away and claiming ownership of plants he had grown with his own labor. Ray lay back down and closed his eyes and tried to find sleep, but knew it would not come easily. Tomorrow Emma would arrive. Tomorrow he would start to understand how to fight. Tomorrow, the 30-day clock would tick down one more day. But tonight he lay in the darkness and talked to Anna's memory one more time. They are trying to take it, Anna. Everything Jonah's built. Everything we kept. They are calling it infringement and claiming I owe them money I do not have. The voice in his head that sounded like her said what she would have said. Then we find out how to fight. We document everything. We ask for help. We do not let them make farming impossible. Ray nodded in the darkness even though no one was there to see it. Outside his window, the October night settled over 640 acres of Nebraska farmland, land that had been in his family for 72 years, land that would be in his family 72 more if he had anything to say about it. The seeds he had saved sat in the grain bin, stored properly, ready for next spring. The seeds his grandfather had saved were documented in a leather ledger that proved the practice was older than the patents claiming to own it. The seeds that Genesis was testing in a laboratory somewhere would either prove his guilt or prove their overreach. Ray did not know which it would be, but he knew that tomorrow he would start fighting, because the alternative was losing the farm and breaking the promise and letting them win. He closed his eyes and let the exhaustion take him eventually, falling into sleep that was fitful and populated by dreams of white vans and soil samples and letters demanding money he did not have. When morning came, he would be ready. He would have his documentation. He would have Emma. He would have the truth. And sometimes, in a world where corporations could claim ownership of genetics older than their patents, truth was the only weapon that mattered. Emma Holloway arrived at the farm on October 21st, driving the silver Honda Accord she had bought when she made partner at Morrison and Grant 3 years ago. The car looked wrong somehow pulling into the gravel driveway, too clean and too new, for a place where vehicles accumulated the dust and mud and history of constant farm use. She parked beside Ray's truck and sat for a moment looking at the farmhouse where she had grown up, the white siding that needed paint, and the porch that sagged slightly on the east corner, and the kitchen window where her mother used to stand watching for headlights to appear at the end of the driveway. Ray came out before Emma could reach the porch steps. He looked older than he had looked 2 months ago when she had visited for his birthday, the weight of the lawsuit visible in the set of his shoulders and the lines around his eyes. They embraced without speaking, the kind of hug that carries everything words cannot reach. When they separated, Emma saw the manila folder tucked under her father's arm. "I have everything," Ray said, "every receipt, every record, Jonas's ledger, all of it." They sat at the kitchen table where 3 generations of Holloways had made decisions about planting dates and equipment purchases, and which fields to rotate into soybeans. Emma spread the documents across the surface, organizing them into categories her legal training had taught her to recognize: contracts, receipts, crop records. The leather ledger sat at the center like a piece of evidence that predated the legal system trying to judge it. She worked in silence for 90 minutes, reading every page, making notes on a yellow legal pad, occasionally asking Ray questions that required short factual answers. When she finally looked up, her expression had changed from professional assessment to something harder. "Dad, this is worse than I thought." Ray felt his chest tighten. How much worse? Emma pulled her laptop from her bag and opened files she had been compiling during the 3-hour drive from Omaha. "I started researching last night. Genesis AgroSciences has filed 47 lawsuits against Nebraska farmers in the past 6 months. Every single one is a small operation under 1,000 acres. Every single one involves seed saving. And every single one is asking for damages between $200,000 and $500,000. She turned the laptop so Ray could see the spreadsheet she had created. Names down the left column, acres farmed, amount sued, status of case. Most showed settled, amounts undisclosed. 3 showed judgment for plaintiff, liens filed. 2 showed foreclosure pending. Ray read through the list and recognized names. Neighbors, people he had known for decades, people who had never mentioned being sued because shame or fear or both had kept them silent. Why are they not talking about this? Emma's voice took on the careful tone she used when explaining legal realities that contradicted common sense. Genesis makes them sign non-disclosure agreements as part of settlement. They agree to pay, usually some reduced amount, and they agree never to discuss the case publicly. Genesis buries them one at a time, and no one knows it is happening to everyone else. Ray thought about the 30-day deadline on his own letter. If he settled, if he agreed to pay something he could barely afford and sign away his right to talk about it, the next farmer would face the same choice alone. And the one after that. And the one after that, each of them isolated and silent and convinced they were the only one stupid enough to save seed without reading 6-point font on a receipt. I am not settling. Emma nodded slowly. I did not think you would. That is why I quit my job this morning. The words took a moment to register. Ray stared at his daughter across the kitchen table and tried to understand what she had just said. You quit Morrison and Grant. I gave my notice at 8 this morning, effective immediately. I told them I had a family emergency that required my full attention. Emma's voice was steady, but Ray could hear the tremor underneath, the sound of a decision made despite fear. I am going to help you fight this. But Dad, we need more than just the two of us. That night at Frank Dietrich's barn, 12 farmers showed up. They came in trucks that ranged from new to ancient, parking in a semicircle around the open barn doors like wagons drawn into defensive formation. The October evening was cold enough that breath made clouds in the light spilling from the bare bulbs Frank had strung from the rafters. Hay bales arranged in rows served as seating. The smell of diesel fuel and old wood and decades of farm work filled the space. Ray recognized everyone. Dutch McKenna at 71, cattle rancher and Vietnam veteran who ran 640 acres with equipment held together by welds and determination. Maria Santos at 54, widow who had taken over her husband's operation after he died in a grain bin accident and made it profitable against every prediction. Tom Russell and his son Kyle, 4th and 5th generation farmers working 1,200 acres in partnership. Others whose names carried the weight of family history, whose presence in this barn meant they trusted Frank and Ray enough to admit to vulnerability. Frank stood at the front near a card table that held a coffee maker and a box of donuts someone had brought. He waited until everyone was settled before speaking, his voice carrying the particular authority that comes from having served in places where authority meant life or death. Most of you know why we are here. Genesis AgroSciences is suing farmers for saving seed. Ray got hit for $280. I got hit for $340. Dutch got hit for $420. I called around today. Every person in this barn either has a lawsuit filed or a letter threatening one. Silence settled over the group, heavy and waiting. Finally Dutch spoke, his voice rough from 71 years of Nebraska weather and 3 years of cigarettes he had smoked in Vietnam before quitting cold when he came home. I saved seed for 49 years. Never had a problem. Never heard anyone say it was illegal. Now they want $420,000 for doing what my father taught me to do. Maria Santos raised her hand tentatively, the gesture of someone not accustomed to speaking in groups. When Frank nodded to her, she spoke quietly but clearly. My husband Carlos died in 2019. I have been running the farm alone since then. 300 acres, enough to make payments and keep our daughter in college. Genesis is suing me for $260. That is more than I will make in 3 years. If I lose everything Carlos built. Tom Russell stood, his son Kyle beside him. We planted Genesis seed in 2022, saved some, planted it in 2024, got tested in September. Letter came last week. 310,000. Kyle and I have been farming together for 6 years, planning for him to take over when I retire. This lawsuit will bankrupt us both. One by one, the farmers told their stories, variations on the same theme. Seed purchased, seed saved, seed tested, lawsuit filed. The amounts varied, but the pattern was identical, suggesting not individual violations but systematic enforcement of terms no one had clearly understood when they made their purchases. Emma stood and introduced herself, explained her legal background, admitted she knew intellectual property law but not agricultural law specifically. Then she said the thing that needed to be said. We need an attorney who specializes in this. Someone who has fought seed companies before. I have been researching. There is a woman in Lincoln, Katherine Porter, who works for Nebraska Farm Bureau. She has handled 23 cases against biotech companies, 118 of them. Dutch leaned forward on his hay bale. What does she cost? Emma shook her head. Farm Bureau attorneys work pro bono for members, but she needs to see evidence this is systematic, not just individual farmers making mistakes. We need to document the pattern. Ray pulled out his folder and showed the group the 2 receipts from 2021 and 2022, the fine print that appeared in the second but not the first. We need everyone to bring their purchase records. Show when the terms changed. Show that they changed it without making it clear. The meeting was breaking up, farmers standing and stretching and speaking quietly among themselves, when the barn door opened and a figure stepped into the light. Everyone turned. Ray felt his body tense with recognition. David Kurtz stood in the doorway wearing civilian clothes instead of the Genesis polo, jeans and a work jacket that looked like something a farmer would wear. His hands were empty and held slightly away from his body in a gesture that might have been surrender or might have been plea. Mr. Holloway, Mr. Dietrich, I know I am not welcome here, but I need to talk to you. Frank moved between David and the group, his posture shifting into something harder. You collected the samples that are being used to sue every person in this room. Why the hell would we listen to anything you have to say? David's voice came out strained but steady. Because I used to be where you are. I was a farmer. Lost my place in 2019. Drought and bad luck and a bank that would not work with me. Genesis hired me in 2020 because I know how farmers think, where they store seed, how to find evidence. They trained me to target people like you. The silence that followed was different than before, charged with attention rather than waiting. Dutch stood slowly. What do you mean, target people like us? David reached into his jacket pocket and every farmer in the barn tensed. He pulled out not a weapon but a phone, held it up so the screen was visible. I kept copies. Everything they told us in training. Everything they made us do. I kept it because I knew eventually I would not be able to live with what they were asking me to do. He tapped the phone and an image appeared on the screen. Even from 20 feet away, Ray could see it was a spreadsheet, columns of data organized with the precision of corporate planning. David walked slowly toward the card table and set his phone down where everyone could see. This is the priority enforcement target list. Genesis creates it every quarter. They use county records and seed purchase history and property tax data to identify farms that have been saving seed for multiple generations. Those farms get moved to the top of the inspection schedule. Emma picked up the phone and zoomed in on the spreadsheet. The first column showed farm names. The second showed years of documented seed saving history based on county agricultural records. The third showed current financial status with notes like recent succession, medical debt noted, equipment loan exposure. The fourth showed enforcement priority ranked 1 through 5. Ray's name was on the list. Row 7. Holloway operation, 70-year seed-saving history per county records, recent widow noted, equipment loan exposure moderate, priority ranking 5. High-value target. He stared at the screen and felt something cold move through his chest. They did not just happen to test my field. They chose me specifically. David nodded. You were flagged in the spring. I got assigned to your sector in August. My quota was 15 farms per quarter. You were number 7 on my list because your 70-year history made you likely to have saved seed, and your financial situation made you vulnerable to settlement pressure. Dutch's voice cut across the barn. What do you mean, settlement pressure? David turned to face him. Genesis does not want to take every case to trial. They want farmers to settle quietly. So they target farms where the lawsuit amount represents existential threat. Enough to force you to settle, but not so much you fight because you have nothing left to lose. It is calculated. Frank stepped closer to David, his expression caught between anger and something else. Why are you telling us this? Because I cannot do it anymore. David's voice broke slightly. I lost my farm. I know what that feels like. And they hired me to do the same thing to other people. I have been collecting evidence for 6 months, training documents, internal emails, target lists, quota structures. Everything that proves this is not about protecting patents. This is about revenue extraction from vulnerable farmers. Emma took control with the decisive efficiency she brought to legal strategy. Mr. Kurtz, we need everything you have. Documents, emails, recordings if you have them. And we need you willing to testify to what you just told us. David looked at Emma and then at Ray. I will give you everything. But you need to know what you are getting into. Genesis has a legal team that has never lost a seed patent case. They have unlimited resources, and they do not negotiate unless they think they are going to lose. Ray stood from his hay bale and walked to where David stood. The younger man looked nervous, uncertain whether he would be accepted or rejected. Ray extended his hand. You did the right thing coming here. David took the hand, and Ray felt the grip of someone who needed forgiveness more than he needed thanks. When they separated, Frank was already pulling out his phone. I need to make some calls. There are more farmers than just this group. If what David is saying is true, we need to find everyone who got sued and get them together. Over the next week, Emma worked from the farmhouse kitchen table that had become command center for something that was starting to look like organized resistance. She called Katherine Porter in Lincoln and sent her David Kurtz's files, and the 2 receipts showing changed terms in Jonas's ledger documenting 72 years of seed saving. Katherine called back 6 hours later with the professional excitement of an attorney who has just seen a case transform from difficult to winnable. I can work with this. The target list alone proves systematic intent. But Emma, I need more plaintiffs. The stronger cases are class actions. We need to show this is affecting dozens of farmers, not just your father. Emma and Frank started making calls. They reached out to every farmer on David's target list who had not yet been sued, warned them what was coming, asked them to document everything. They contacted farmers who had already settled under non-disclosure agreements, explained that NDAs signed under duress based on fraudulent practices might not be enforceable, asked them if they would consider joining a class action. By October 28th, they had identified 47 farmers across Nebraska who had either been sued or received threat letters from Genesis. 32 agreed to preliminary meetings. 18 committed to joining legal action regardless of outcome. Emma researched Genesis AgroSciences and found information that made her call Ray into the kitchen at midnight to show him what she had discovered on her laptop screen. The company website showed executive leadership. At the top was Dr. Marcus Webb, Chief Executive Officer. Emma clicked to his biography page. Before joining Genesis in 2021, Dr. Webb spent 15 years at Monsanto Corporation, where he led enforcement operations for seed patent compliance. He resigned in 2019 following internal disputes about enforcement practices. Genesis hired him with a mandate to maximize patent compliance revenue. She pulled up a news article from 2019. Agricultural Insider magazine, headline reading Monsanto, executive departure raises questions about enforcement tactics. The article detailed Marcus Webb's approach at Monsanto, described by former colleagues as aggressive to the point of ruthless. One unnamed source was quoted saying Webb believed small farmers were inefficient and that consolidation should be accelerated through any legal means available. Ray read the article twice. They hired him specifically because he is willing to destroy farms to increase profit. Emma pulled up another document, this one from Genesis's quarterly earnings report filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission. She pointed to a line item in the revenue breakdown. Seed compliance and licensing fees, $18 million annual budget, projected growth 30% year over year. They are not protecting patents, Dad. They are running a profit center based on suing farmers. Webb's compensation is probably tied to how much money he extracts. The community meeting on November 3rd drew 317 people to the high school gymnasium in Kearney. Farmers and their families, ag suppliers, local business owners, reporters from the Omaha World Herald and Lincoln Journal-Star, a camera crew from the local television station. The stands filled, and people stood along the walls, and the energy in the space carried the particular intensity of a community realizing it faces a threat that affects everyone. Katherine Porter stood at a podium set up on the gymnasium floor. She was 46 years old and looked like someone who had spent those years learning how to win arguments in rooms where everyone else wanted her to lose. Gray suit, practical shoes, reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She spoke without notes in language that stripped legal complexity down to accessible truth. Genesis AgroSciences is suing 47 Nebraska farmers for a total of $13.2 million. They claim patent infringement, but their own documents prove this is not about protecting intellectual property. This is about targeting vulnerable family farms for revenue extraction. She displayed David Kurtz's spreadsheet on a screen behind her, the names redacted but the targeting criteria visible. They identified farms with multi-generational seed-saving history. They cross-referenced financial stress indicators. They assigned priority rankings based on likelihood to settle quietly. This is not law enforcement. This is predatory litigation. The gymnasium erupted in angry voices. Katherine waited for quiet before continuing. We are filing a class action lawsuit representing 32 farmers. We are asking for the court to declare Genesis's seed compliance program fraudulent and void all pending lawsuits. We are seeking damages for emotional distress and business interference. And we are demanding injunctive relief to stop this practice. A man in the front row stood. Ray recognized him as Carl Morrison, reporter for the World Herald. Ms. Porter, Genesis will argue these farmers agreed to the terms when they purchased seed. How do you counter that? Katherine pulled up an image of the two receipts Emma had found, 2021 and 2022, side by side. In March 2021, Genesis receipts contained no restrictions on seed saving. In March 2022, they added single-season use language in 6-point font at the bottom of the receipt with no verbal disclosure, no prominent notice, no education about what the change meant. That is not informed consent. That is deception. Another hand went up. Woman in her 50s, face Ray did not recognize. My husband is being sued for $380,000. We have been married 32 years. He has never done anything illegal in his life. Now Genesis is calling him a thief for farming the way his father farmed. How do we live with that? Before Katherine could answer, Dutch McKenna stood in the bleachers. His voice carried the particular authority of someone who has served in combat and come home believing that service meant something. I am 71 years old. I spent 2 years in Vietnam getting shot at so this country could stay free. I came home and farmed for 49 years, doing honest work, paying my taxes, feeding people. Now a corporation wants $420,000 for doing what my father taught me. You want to know how we live with it? We fight. We show them that farmers do not give up just because some suit in an office says we owe them money we do not have. The gymnasium erupted in applause. When it faded, Frank Dietrich stood in the back. Ray saw him and felt something tighten in recognition of what was coming. I want to tell you about my cousin Carl. Frank's voice was steady, but Ray could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. Carl Dietrich farmed in Iowa. 800 acres his grandfather bought in 1947. He saved seed same as all of us. Genesis sued him in March for $420,000. Carl tried to fight, spent every dollar he had on legal fees, lost the case in August. The judgment took everything. His farm, his equipment, his savings. Everything his family built for 3 generations. Frank paused, and the silence in the gymnasium was absolute. Carl wrote a letter before he died. His widow Linda asked me to share it. He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket and unfolded it with hands that shook slightly. The words he read were in someone else's handwriting, but Frank's voice made them immediate and present. To whoever finds this, I cannot face my children and tell them I lost the farm their great-grandfather built because I saved seed the way every farmer has saved seed since farming existed. Genesis AgroSciences called it patent infringement. I called it farming. The court agreed with them. I cannot live with what that means. I am sorry I am not stronger. Please tell Linda I love her and the kids. Tell them this was not about being weak. This was about being broken by a system that makes farming impossible. Carl Dietrich, August 12, 2024. Frank folded the paper and looked out at the 300 people in the gymnasium. Carl was 49 years old. He left behind a wife and 3 kids and a farm that Genesis is selling at auction next month. That is what happens when we fight alone. That is why we need to fight together. The meeting continued for another 90 minutes, but Ray barely heard it. He sat in the bleachers and thought about Carl Dietrich, a man he had never met but whose story was his story might have been if the lawsuit had come 5 years earlier when Anna was sick, and the medical bills were piling up, and the farm was already at the edge of what it could sustain. Carl had fought and lost, and decided the shame was worse than ending it. After the meeting, Emma found Ray in the parking lot standing beside his truck and staring at nothing. She knew better than to ask if he was okay. Instead, she just stood with him in the November evening and let the silence carry what words could not. Finally, Ray spoke. I could have been Carl. If this had happened when your mother was sick, if I had been alone, I could have been him. Emma's voice was quiet but firm. But you are not alone, and we are not giving up. The next morning, Katherine Porter called with news that changed everything. A woman identifying herself only as a concerned scientist had contacted the Farm Bureau office with information about Genesis AgroSciences. She claimed to have evidence that the DNA testing used in enforcement cases was fundamentally flawed and that the company knew it. She was willing to meet, but only in private, and only if confidentiality could be guaranteed. Ray and Emma drove to Lincoln on November 8th. Katherine had arranged the meeting at a coffee shop far enough from the city center to offer anonymity. The woman who arrived at the appointed time was early 40s, professional clothes partially hidden under a coat despite the warmth inside, eyes that kept scanning the space as if expecting to be recognized. She sat without offering her name. Katherine made brief introductions. Ray and Emma Holloway. This is Dr. Alina Vasquez. She is the lead geneticist at Genesis AgroSciences. Dr. Vasquez pulled a USB drive from her purse and set it on the table between them. I have been working for Genesis for 8 years. I ran the DNA analysis on your seed, Mr. Holloway. Her voice was controlled, but Ray could hear the strain underneath. Your grandfather's seed saving created something Genesis did not account for. Over 70 years, the genetics naturally mutated. Adapted to your specific soil conditions, your climate, your selection for drought tolerance and high yield. What you planted was genetically distinct from Genesis, GS4477. Ray felt something shift in his chest. You mean it was not their seed anymore? Legally, the patent claims cover genetic sequences. Dr. Vasquez tapped the USB drive. I ran the full analysis. Your seed shares maybe 68% genetic similarity with Genesis patents. The rest is natural mutation plus selection pressures your family applied over decades. By any reasonable scientific standard, you created a new variety. Then why did you classify it as infringement? Dr. Vasquez looked down at her coffee cup. Because Marcus Webb told me to. I gave him my analysis. Showed him that your seed and dozens of other farmers' seeds were genetically distinct. He said it did not matter. He said if there was any detectable Genesis marker, classify it as infringement. Revenue targets had to be met. Katherine leaned forward. Dr. Vasquez, are you willing to testify to this? The geneticist was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. If I testify, I lose my job. I lose my career. Genesis will destroy my credibility. Emma spoke for the first time. If you do not testify, farmers like my father lose everything. Carl Dietrich lost everything. How many more before this stops? Dr. Vasquez looked at Emma and then at Ray. Her eyes filled, but no tears fell. I will testify, but I need protection. I need guarantees. Katherine pulled out documents already prepared. Whistleblower protections under federal law. Non-retaliation clauses. Everything we can provide. Dr. Vasquez signed without reading, her hand shaking slightly. The USB drive contains 214 test results. Every single one shows the same pattern. Farmers saved seed genetically distinct from Genesis patents. Every single one was classified as infringement on Webb's orders. This is fraud, Ms. Porter. Systematic, intentional fraud. Ray took the USB drive and felt its weight. Less than an ounce of plastic and silicon that contained proof of what he had known intuitively, but could not prove scientifically. His grandfather's practice of saving the best seed had created something new, something better adapted to this specific piece of Nebraska ground than anything a corporation could develop in a laboratory. And Genesis had called it theft. They left the coffee shop separately, Dr. Vasquez disappearing into the afternoon, while Ray and Emma and Katherine returned to Katherine's office to review the USB contents. What they found was more devastating than anything they had hoped for. Spreadsheets showing false positive rates in DNA testing acknowledged but suppressed. Emails between Marcus Webb and lab supervisors directing them to classify borderline cases as infringement to meet quarterly revenue targets. Training documents teaching field inspectors like David Kurtz how to identify financially vulnerable farms for priority enforcement. Katherine sat at her desk and read through files with the focused intensity of an attorney who has just watched a difficult case become a certain victory. This is not just evidence, she said quietly. This is ammunition. Genesis is going to wish they never went after your father. Emma and Ray drove back to the farm in darkness, the November night settling over fields that had been harvested and now sat waiting for winter. They did not talk much. The weight of what they had learned sat between them, too large for conversation. Carl Dietrich had died thinking he was a thief. 47 farmers were facing lawsuits thinking they had committed crimes. And all of it was built on fraud, on DNA tests manipulated to produce predetermined results, on a system designed not to protect innovation, but to extract maximum profit from people least able to resist. When they reached the farm, Ray sat in the truck for a long moment before getting out. Through the windshield he could see the barn where Jonas had taught him to select seed, where the leather ledger documented 72 years of careful observation and selection. That knowledge had created something valuable enough that a corporation wanted to claim ownership. And that fact, more than anything else, proved Jonas had been right about saving seed being insurance. Emma touched his shoulder. "We are going to win this, Dad." Ray nodded slowly. "I know, but Carl Dietrich will still be dead, and every farmer who settled in shame will still carry that shame. Winning does not undo what they did." "No," Emma agreed, "but it stops them from doing it to anyone else." Ray looked at his daughter in the dim light of the truck cab and saw Anna's determination in her eyes, saw the particular fierceness that came from understanding that some fights matter more than personal cost. She had quit her job. She had walked away from everything she had built in Omaha. She had come home to fight beside him because the promise Anna made him keep was the same promise Emma was keeping now. The farm would continue. The practice would survive. And no corporation would be allowed to call tradition theft without being forced to prove it in front of people who understood what farming actually meant. Together they walked to the farmhouse through November darkness, carrying between them the USB drive that would change everything and the knowledge that sometimes the seeds you save are not just corn or soybeans, but truth itself, documented and preserved and ready to grow when planted in fertile ground. Katherine Porter filed the class action lawsuit on November 15, 2024 in Federal District Court in Omaha. 32 Nebraska farmers listed as plaintiffs, Raymond Holloway named first among them. The complaint ran 87 pages, each one documenting a pattern of fraud so systematic it read less like legal argument and more like criminal indictment. Genesis AgroSciences was accused of fraudulent business practices, deceptive trade, breach of contract, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and violations of Nebraska Consumer Protection Act. The damages sought totaled $47 million, but the complaint asked for something more valuable than money. It requested the court declare Genesis's entire seed compliance program void, dismiss all pending lawsuits against farmers, and issue permanent injunction preventing the company from enforcing patent claims based on manipulated DNA testing. Ray sat in Katherine's office when she filed electronically, watching the progress bar crawl across her computer screen as the document uploaded to the court system. When it reached 100% and the confirmation appeared, Katherine leaned back in her chair with the satisfied expression of someone who has just committed an act of professional warfare. Now they have to respond, and when they respond, we get discovery. Every email, every memo, every training document, everything David and Dr. Vasquez gave us becomes evidence they have to acknowledge or deny under oath. Emma sat beside Ray taking notes on her legal pad. How long until they respond? 21 days. They will ask for extension. We will object. Judge will probably give them 30 days maximum. So figure mid-December we start getting their internal documents. Genesis responded not with legal filings but with lawyers. The firm of Winston and Burke out of Chicago arrived in Nebraska like an occupying force, 3 senior partners, and a team of associates who took over an entire floor of the Omaha Hilton and began preparing defense with resources that seemed unlimited. Their reputation preceded them. 89% win rate in intellectual property cases. Never lost a seed patent dispute. Known for aggressive tactics and overwhelming opposition, with paperwork and motions and procedural warfare, designed to bankrupt plaintiffs before trial even began. The lead attorney was a man named Harrison Croft, 62 years old, Harvard Law School, partner at Winston & Burke for 27 years. He had defended Monsanto in the Supreme Court and won. He had represented pharmaceutical companies in patent disputes worth billions. He wore suits that cost more than Ray's monthly mortgage payment and spoke with the absolute confidence of someone who had never encountered a problem money and persistence could not solve. His first move was filing a motion to dismiss on technical grounds, arguing the plaintiffs lacked standing because they had agreed to licensing terms when they purchased seed. Katherine countered with the receipts showing changed terms without clear notice. Croft filed a motion to compel arbitration, claiming the seed purchase agreements required disputes be settled outside court. Katherine produced contracts showing that clause was added after the purchases in question. Back and forth for 3 weeks, legal chess played with motions and counter-motions and briefs that grew longer with each exchange. Ray watched from the farmhouse and felt increasingly like a spectator in a game whose rules he did not understand and whose outcome would determine whether he kept the farm or lost everything. On December 3rd, a package arrived at the farm with no return address, just Ray's name and address written in block letters on brown paper wrapping. Inside was a USB drive and a note typed on plain white paper. "They are lying about everything. This proves it. A friend." Ray called Emma and Katherine. They drove out to the farm that evening and sat at the kitchen table while Ray plugged the USB into his laptop. The drive contained 3 folders: executive recordings, internal emails, DNA testing protocols. Katherine opened the first folder and found audio files dated throughout 2022 and 2023. She clicked on one labeled Executive Strategy Meeting March 2022. Marcus Webb's voice filled the kitchen, recorded clearly enough to suggest the source had been in the room or had access to meeting recordings. Small farms are fundamentally inefficient. They tie up land that could be consolidated into larger operations with better economies of scale. Our seed compliance program accelerates this natural market evolution. We identify farms operating on thin margins, enforce patents aggressively, and create financial pressure that forces sale to larger operators or corporate agriculture entities. The beauty of the system is it is completely legal. Another voice, older, asked a question: "What is our revenue target?" Webb answered without hesitation: $340 million over 5 years from enforcement fees and settlements. Year 1, we hit $41 million. Year 2 target is $72 million. To reach that, we need to expand enforcement to at least 200 farms annually, prioritizing multi-generational operations with documented seed-saving history. The recording continued for 40 more minutes, Webb and other executives discussing targeting strategies, settlement pressure tactics, media management if farmers tried to fight publicly. At one point, someone raised concern about false positive rates in DNA testing. Webb's response was captured with crystalline clarity: "The testing accuracy is irrelevant if we settle before trial. 93% of farmers settle when faced with 6-figure judgments. For the 7% who fight, we have legal resources they cannot match. Even if we lose occasionally, the revenue from the 93% more than covers our costs." Emma paused the recording. Her hands were shaking. "This is admission of fraud. Recorded, dated, clearly Webb's voice. This destroys their entire defense." Katherine was already taking notes. "Keep playing. We need to hear all of it." They listened to 5 more recordings, each one more damaging than the last. Webb discussing how to identify financially vulnerable farms based on property tax records and loan data. Webb explaining bonus structures tied directly to enforcement revenue. Webb dismissing concerns about destroying family farms with a comment that made Ray's blood go cold. Agriculture is evolving. Small farms are artifacts of an earlier era. If our enforcement program accelerates their exit from the market, we are simply recognizing economic reality. Some farms should fail. That is capitalism. The internal emails folder contained correspondence between Webb and laboratory supervisors, field inspectors, legal staff. One email chain from April 2023 discussed DNA testing methodology. A lab supervisor wrote to Webb expressing concern that their testing protocols were producing false positives at rates significantly higher than industry standard. Dr. Webb, our genetic marker analysis is showing positive results in samples that appear to be naturally mutated varieties with minimal Genesis genetic content. The threshold we are using to classify infringement would be considered scientifically questionable by peer review standards. I recommend we adjust our methodology to reduce false positive rate. Webb's response was 2 sentences. Our methodology is approved by our legal department and serves our business needs. Continue current protocols. Another email from June 2023 showed Webb directing staff to suppress test results that showed farmer-saved seed was genetically distinct. The lab supervisor had written detailed analysis of 12 different farmer samples, each showing significant genetic divergence from Genesis patents through natural mutation and selective breeding. Webb's reply was marked urgent and copied to legal department. These results do not leave this department. Classification remains infringement across all samples. Revenue targets are non-negotiable. Emma read through the email chains with the focused intensity of someone building a case. Every single email is dated, authenticated through company servers, includes Webb's executive signature. This is not hearsay. This is documentary evidence of systematic fraud. The DNA testing protocols folder contained technical documents showing Genesis's internal testing methodology compared to industry standards. Ray could not understand most of the scientific language, but Katherine and Emma worked through it together, Katherine reading aloud while Emma cross-referenced with Dr. Vasquez's earlier statements. They are using a genetic similarity threshold of 40% to claim infringement. Katherine looked up from the screen. Industry standard for patent protection is 90% or higher. They are classifying samples as infringement that share less than half their genetics with Genesis patents, which means Ray's seed at 68% similarity was massively over the threshold for infringement, but still nowhere near actual Genesis genetics. Emma pulled up Dr. Vasquez's analysis from the earlier USB drive and compared the numbers. Dr. Vasquez was right. Dad's seed is a distinct variety. Genesis knew it and classified it as infringement anyway because 40% was good enough for their legal purposes. Ray stood and walked to the kitchen window. Outside, December darkness had settled over the farm, the kind of cold, clear night where stars were visible in quantities city people never saw. He thought about Marcus Webb in an office somewhere making decisions about which farms should fail, which farmers were artifacts of an earlier era, which families should be destroyed to meet revenue targets. Who sent this? Katherine shook her head. Someone with access to executive meetings and company servers. Someone who wanted us to have evidence that could not be obtained through legal discovery. Someone who knows what Genesis is doing and cannot live with it anymore. The next morning, Ray woke to find his DUI arrest from 2019 on the front page of the Omaha World-Herald. The headline read, "Local farmer fighting seed patent case has prior drunk driving conviction." The article detailed his arrest on November 3, 2019, 3 days after Anna's funeral. Blood alcohol level .12. Guilty plea. License suspended 6 months. Fine paid. The article did not mention that Ray had been driving home from the cemetery at 2 in the afternoon, had pulled over and sat in the truck crying, had tried to drive home, and made it maybe 5 miles before a sheriff's deputy noticed his erratic lane keeping. It did not mention that the judge who sentenced him had said on the record that grief does not excuse poor judgment, but does explain it. It did not mention that Ray had not had a drink since that day, had not driven with anything in his system except coffee and regret. What the article did mention was that Ray was now claiming Genesis AgroSciences had fabricated evidence against him, that he was suing for $47 million, that his credibility was central to the case. The implication was clear without being stated directly. Man with drunk driving conviction claims multi-billion-dollar corporation is lying. Readers could draw their own conclusions. Emma called at 7 in the morning, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Dad, do not read the comments online. Do not engage with anyone about this. We knew they would come after your credibility. This is what they do." I read it. Ray sat at the kitchen table with the newspaper in front of him and coffee growing cold in his cup. They made it sound like I am some drunk making up stories about being persecuted. Katherine is already drafting response. She is going to release the executive recordings this afternoon. When people hear Webb talking about destroying farms to meet revenue targets, your DUI from 5 years ago will not matter. But it does matter, Emma. It gives people reason to doubt me. Only people who want to doubt you. Everyone else will see a grieving husband who made one mistake and has been paying for it ever since. The phone calls started before noon. Reporters wanting comment. Neighbors expressing support or concern depending on their relationship with Ray and their tolerance for complexity. A few calls from people Ray did not know, farmers from other states who had seen the article and wanted to share their own stories of being targeted by Genesis. One call came from a man who identified himself as Tom Burke, calling from Iowa. "My brother Carl was sued by Genesis in March. He lost everything. He killed himself in August. Now I am reading that the whole system was fraudulent and my brother died because some executive wanted to meet a revenue target." The man's voice broke and Ray felt his own throat tighten. He thought about Carl Dietrich's suicide note, about farms lost to settlements, about families destroyed by a program designed not to protect innovation, but to extract profit from vulnerable people. How many more Carl Dietrichs were out there, scattered across farm country, each one convinced they had failed when really the system had been rigged against them from the beginning? "I am sorry about your brother. We are going to make sure everyone knows what Genesis did. We are going to make sure it does not happen to anyone else." Tom Burke was quiet for a moment. Then he said the thing that Ray would remember long after the call ended. "My brother saved seed for 32 years. He thought it made him a good farmer. Genesis made him think it made him a criminal. That shame killed him more than the money did." Katherine released the executive recordings at 3 that afternoon through a press conference at the Nebraska Farm Bureau office in Lincoln. She played excerpts for reporters, Webb's voice filling the room describing small farms as artifacts that should fail, enforcement as a tool for accelerating consolidation, revenue targets as non-negotiable regardless of false positive rates in testing. The story moved from local news to national within hours. Agricultural trade publications picked it up. NPR ran a segment. Cable news mentioned it on evening broadcasts. The narrative shifted from farmer with credibility problems suing corporation to corporation caught on tape admitting systematic fraud against family farms. Genesis issued a statement through Harrison Croft denying wrongdoing and claiming the recordings were taken out of context. But the context was clear to anyone who listened. Marcus Webb had said exactly what he meant. Small farms should fail. Enforcement accelerated that process. Revenue targets justified questionable testing methodology. On December 10th, Frank Dietrich called Ray at 6 in the morning. His voice sounded wrong, strained, and faint, like it was traveling a distance greater than the 8 miles between their farms. "Ray, I need help." "What is wrong?" "I think I am having a heart attack." Ray was in his truck before Frank finished the sentence, driving too fast on gravel roads still slick with morning frost, calling 911 while he drove, giving the dispatcher Frank's address and description of symptoms. He reached Frank's house as the ambulance was arriving, found his neighbor sitting on the porch steps with one hand pressed to his chest and his face the color of ash. The EMTs loaded Frank onto a stretcher, and Ray followed the ambulance to the hospital in Kearney, calling Frank's wife Martha, who was visiting their daughter in Colorado, telling her what he knew, which was not enough and too much at the same time. "Heart attack. Serious. Doctor's working on him now. Come home." Ray sat in the waiting room at Kearney Regional Medical Center for 6 hours before a doctor appeared and delivered news that carried the weight of finality wrapped in medical language. Frank had suffered major cardiac event, likely brought on by extended stress. They had stabilized him, but the damage was significant. Prognosis uncertain. Next 72 hours would determine outcome. Martha arrived that evening, and Ray gave her what comfort he could, but comfort felt inadequate against the reality sitting between them. Frank was 63 years old, Vietnam veteran, farmer who had worked hard his entire life and never asked for anything he had not earned. And now he was in intensive care because the stress of a $340,000 lawsuit for doing what his father had taught him had put enough pressure on his heart that something fundamental broke. Ray drove home through December darkness thinking about Gary Henderson in Indiana, who had died from the same kind of stress, heart unable to sustain the pressure of losing everything to a lawsuit based on fraud. Now Frank was fighting for his life in a hospital bed, and even if he survived, something had been taken that could not be returned. The convoy to Lincoln organized itself through the same Facebook group that had connected farmers after Ray's lawsuit became public. Someone suggested a physical demonstration, something that would make visible the scale of what Genesis had done. Dutch McKenna proposed driving tractors to the state capitol, parking them in a formation that news helicopters could photograph from above, staying until someone in power acknowledged what was happening. 28 farmers committed to bringing equipment. Ray volunteered his truck and grain trailer. The plan was simple: drive to Lincoln on December 18th, park on the Capitol grounds, remain peaceful, demand that Governor Patricia Chen's office investigate Genesis for fraud and consumer protection violations. They departed from Kearney at 4 in the morning. A line of tractors and trucks and trailers stretching maybe 2 miles along Highway 6, running lights creating a river of amber in the pre-dawn darkness. Ray drove near the front of the convoy with Dutch in the passenger seat, the old veteran looking out at the procession of equipment, and saying very little, but radiating the quiet satisfaction of someone who understands the power of visible solidarity. The sun came up as they reached the outskirts of Lincoln, December light, cold, and clear, illuminating 28 pieces of farm equipment moving in coordinated formation toward the center of state government. They reached the Capitol at 8:47 and began parking in the lot designated for public demonstrations, arranging tractors in rows facing the building, each one positioned so its profile was visible from above. Ray climbed down from his truck and stood among the assembled equipment, looking at John Deere and Case IH and New Holland machines representing millions of dollars in farm investment, each one operated by someone who had been told they owed money for farming the way their families had farmed for generations. The tractors sat silent with engines off, a statement made not through noise but through presence. Dutch walked among the rows, organizing farmers into shifts, making sure someone was always present with each machine, coordinating with Lincoln police who had arrived to manage traffic and maintain order. The police were professional and polite, treating the demonstration as protected speech rather than threat. One officer told Dutch he had grown up on a farm outside Omaha, understood what this was about, hoped the farmers got justice. News crews arrived before 9. Helicopters appeared overhead getting aerial footage. Reporters interviewed farmers who told stories about lawsuits and settlements and fear, and the recording of Marcus Webb talking about revenue targets. Ray gave 3 interviews saying the same thing in different words. Genesis used fraud to destroy farms. We have evidence. We need the state to act. At 11:15, a representative from the governor's office appeared. Young woman in professional clothes carrying a tablet, clearly sent to manage a situation no one had briefed her adequately on. She spoke with Dutch and Ray, promised to convey their concerns to the governor, asked if they would consider leaving the Capitol grounds. Dutch's response was polite but absolute. We are staying until your governor makes a public statement about investigating Genesis AgroSciences. We have evidence of fraud. We have farmers who lost everything. We had one farmer die from stress. Tell Governor Chen we are not leaving until she acknowledges that this matters. The representative retreated to the Capitol building. The farmers settled in for the wait, unpacking lunches and coffee thermoses and folding chairs, organizing themselves into something between protest and occupation. The December day was cold enough that breath made clouds, but the farmers wore the layers they wore for winter field work and seemed comfortable with discomfort. At 2:30 in the afternoon, Governor Patricia Chen appeared on the Capitol steps. She was 51 years old, second term, known for agricultural advocacy and careful political positioning. She spoke without notes, addressing the cameras and the farmers with equal directness. I am aware of the allegations against Genesis AgroSciences. I have reviewed evidence provided by the plaintiffs in the pending federal lawsuit. Based on what I have seen, I am directing the Nebraska Department of Agriculture to open an investigation into Genesis's seed compliance program for potential violations of state consumer protection laws and fraudulent business practices. The farmers began applauding. Governor Chen raised her hand for quiet and continued. Nebraska farmers are the foundation of our state economy and our rural communities. If a corporation is using deceptive practices to extract money from family farms, that is not capitalism. That is fraud, and this state will not tolerate it. She answered 3 questions from reporters, then returned inside. The farmers began packing up equipment, the demonstration successful beyond what any of them had hoped. A governor had committed publicly to investigating Genesis. The political pressure that corporations feared most had just been applied with the full weight of state authority behind it. Ray was loading his truck when a reporter from the Lincoln Journal-Star approached asking for comment. He thought about everything that had happened since October 12th when white vans appeared in his field, thought about Carl Dietrich and Frank Dietrich and farms lost and families broken, thought about Marcus Webb's voice on those recordings saying some farms should fail. All we wanted was to farm the way our families have farmed for generations. Genesis called it infringement. The governor just called it what it really is: fraud. The convoy dispersed, farmers driving back to operations that needed attention despite the time spent in Lincoln. Ray drove home with Dutch, both of them quiet with exhaustion and something that felt like vindication beginning to form. The December afternoon was fading to evening when Dutch spoke for the first time in an hour. Frank would have wanted to be here today. Ray nodded. He is fighting his own battle right now. When he gets better, we will tell him about this. If he gets better. When he gets better, Dutch, we do not accept the alternative. That night Ray visited Frank in the hospital. Martha was asleep in the chair beside the bed, exhausted from 3 days of vigil. Frank was awake, connected to monitors that beeped steadily, his color better than it had been but still carrying the pallor of someone whose body had failed him and was slowly remembering how to work. Governor Chen opened an investigation, Ray said quietly. We took 28 tractors to Lincoln. She came out and made a statement, said Genesis committed fraud. Frank smiled weakly. Wish I could have been there. You were every farmer there was fighting for all of us, including you. They sat in silence for a while, the hospital room filled with the sounds of medical equipment and distant pages over the intercom. Finally Frank spoke again, his voice rough. I am scared, Ray, not of dying, of losing the farm because I am too sick to fight anymore, of Martha having to deal with this lawsuit alone if something happens to me. Nothing is going to happen to you, and you are not fighting alone. We have Katherine, we have Emma, we have evidence that destroys their case. You just focus on getting better. Frank closed his eyes. Ray sat with him until visiting hours ended, then drove home through December darkness thinking about hearts that failed under pressure and farms that survived against odds and the difference between the two. The news broke on December 20th with a press conference that Ray watched from his kitchen on a laptop streaming live video. David Kurtz stood at a podium in downtown Omaha, flanked by Katherine Porter and two other attorneys Ray did not recognize. He looked nervous but determined, reading from prepared remarks with hands that shook slightly. My name is David Kurtz. I worked as a field inspector for Genesis AgroSciences Seed Compliance Division from 2020 to 2024. I am here today to resign publicly and to testify about what I was trained to do. He explained the targeting protocols, the quota systems, the training that taught inspectors how to identify vulnerable farms. He described being rewarded for enforcement volume, penalized for missing targets, encouraged to view farmers not as customers but as revenue sources. He produced training manuals marked confidential, showed them to cameras, explained how each chapter was designed to maximize settlement pressure. We were taught to collect samples in ways that maximized positive results even if the science was questionable. We were taught to time inspections during financial stress periods when farmers were least able to fight. We were taught to present lawsuits as inevitable and settlement as the only rational choice. Reporters asked questions. David answered them with increasing confidence. Yes, he felt guilt. Yes, he understood he had participated in harming people. Yes, he was willing to testify in the federal lawsuit and provide all documentation in his possession. Katherine spoke next, placing the training manuals on the podium. Mr. Kurtz has provided extensive evidence of systematic fraud. Combined with the executive recordings and Dr. Vasquez's DNA testing analysis, we now have 3 independent sources proving Genesis AgroSciences designed their compliance program to extract money from farmers through deceptive practices. This is not a few bad actors. This is corporate policy from the executive level down. The news coverage that evening put David's resignation alongside the governor's investigation announcement, the two developments creating a narrative of Genesis losing control. What had started as individual farmers facing lawsuits was transforming into multi-front assault on a corporation that had built a profit center on fraud. Ray received a call that night from Emma with news that completed the pattern. She had been researching Marcus Webb's compensation structure, cross-referencing SEC filings and corporate disclosures. What she found was documented proof of what everyone had suspected. Dad, Webb's employment contract ties his compensation directly to seed compliance revenue. He has a base salary of $400,000 plus performance bonuses up to 12 times base. The bonus formula is explicit: 2% of gross compliance division revenue. Ray did the math. If the division brought in $41 million in year one like the recordings mentioned, Webb's bonus would be $820,000, plus base salary, over $1.2 million total. Emma continued. In 2023, the compliance division revenue was $237 million according to their SEC filing. Webb's bonus that year was $4.7 million. He made more from suing farmers than most farmers make in their entire careers. Ray sat in the darkness of his farmhouse trying to process the number. $4.7 million. Money made by destroying farms, by pushing families into bankruptcy, by creating pressure that stopped hearts and drove people to suicide. Money extracted through fraud and deception and systematic exploitation of people who had trusted that buying seed meant buying seed, not entering into a legal framework designed to criminalize farming practices older than patent law. "This is what we show the jury," Emma said. "This is the number that proves everything." Webb was not protecting patents. He was extracting maximum profit from farmers least able to resist, and he got rich doing it. Ray thought about Carl Dietrich, who died believing he was a thief, about Frank Dietrich fighting for his life in a hospital bed, about 47 farmers facing lawsuits designed not to protect innovation, but to meet revenue targets that paid executive bonuses, about Jonas saving seed for 72 years and teaching Ray that good farmers preserve the best of what they grow. How did we let this happen? How did we let corporations turn farming into something where saving your best seed makes you a criminal? Emma was quiet for a moment. "I do not think we let it happen, Dad. I think it happened while we were not paying attention. They changed the rules in 6-point font at the bottom of receipts. They built enforcement systems in corporate offices far from farms. They hired executives who saw consolidation as progress and small farms as artifacts. And by the time anyone noticed, they had the law and the lawyers and the resources to make fighting back almost impossible." "Almost," Ray said, "but not quite." "No," Emma agreed. "Not quite. Because you documented everything. Because you kept Jonas's ledger. Because you asked for help. Because 47 other farmers were willing to join the fight. And because some people inside Genesis could not live with what they were doing and gave us evidence we could never have obtained alone." Ray looked out the kitchen window at December darkness covering 640 acres of Nebraska farmland. The land Jonas had bought in 1952. The land Ray had promised Anna he would keep. The land that Genesis had tried to take through fraud disguised as law enforcement. Somewhere in Chicago, Harrison Croft and his team at Winston and Burke were preparing defense arguments and counter motions and strategies designed to overwhelm the farmers with procedural complexity. Somewhere in a Genesis AgroSciences office, Marcus Webb was calculating whether his $4.7 million bonus would survive public scrutiny and federal investigation. Somewhere in hospitals and farmhouses across the Midwest, farmers were fighting battles that should never have been necessary, defending themselves against charges that should never have been filed. But here in this kitchen, with Emma on the phone and evidence piling up and a trial date approaching, Ray felt something he had not felt since the morning the white van appeared in his field. He felt like winning was possible, not certain, not guaranteed, but possible in a way it had not been before David's resignation and the governor's investigation and the revelation of Webb's compensation structure. The truth was assembling itself piece by piece. Executive recordings, DNA testing fraud, training manuals, whistleblower testimony, compensation tied to revenue extraction. Each piece of evidence another brick in a wall that would either protect the farmers or collapse under the weight of corporate legal power. Ray said goodnight to Emma and sat in the darkness thinking about seeds. the seeds Jonas had saved through the Depression and the Dust Bowl and every crisis for 72 years. The seeds Ray had saved and planted and harvested and been sued for. The seeds that Genesis claimed to own through patent law, but that really belonged to the land and the farmers who had selected them for generations. In the grain bin outside, 200 bushels of saved seed sat waiting for spring planting. Seed that DNA analysis proved was genetically distinct from Genesis patents. Seed created through natural mutation and deliberate selection over decades. Seed that represented not theft but evolution, not infringement but inheritance. Those seeds would be planted in April if Ray still had a farm to plant them in. The trial would determine that. The jury would decide whether saving seed was farming or fraud, whether Genesis had protected innovation or perpetrated deception, whether small farms were artifacts that should fail or foundations that should be preserved. Ray stood and walked through the dark farmhouse to the bedroom he had shared with Anna. Her photograph sat on the nightstand, taken at harvest maybe 10 years ago, her smile caught in afternoon light that made her look younger than she had been. He spoke to the photograph the way he spoke to her memory every night. "We are fighting, Anna. Emma quit her job to help. Katherine is building the case. We have evidence they committed fraud. Frank is in the hospital, but he is going to make it. Dutch drove a tractor to Lincoln. The governor opened an investigation. We are going to win this." The photograph did not answer, but Ray heard Anna's voice anyway, the memory of her saying what she would have said if she could still say anything. "Then stop worrying and start believing. You have done everything right. Now let the truth work." Ray nodded in the darkness and climbed into bed and let exhaustion take him, falling into sleep that came easier than it had in weeks because, for the first time since this began, he believed what Anna's memory had told him. The truth would work. The evidence would speak. And when it did, Genesis would answer for what they had done to farmers who had committed no crime except practicing agriculture the way it had been practiced since agriculture began. Outside his window, December stars wheeled across Nebraska sky above 640 acres that had survived 72 years of weather and markets and crises, and would survive this too because the seeds saved were the seeds that endured, and the truth documented was the truth that won. The trial began on January 10, 2025 in Federal District Court in Omaha, Courtroom 3B on the 4th floor of the Roman L. Hruska Federal Courthouse. The building was all glass and concrete, and the particular institutional authority that federal architecture projects, designed to make visitors feel the weight of law before they ever entered a courtroom. Ray arrived at 8:30 with Emma and Katherine, passing through security that treated everyone with equal suspicion, regardless of whether they were plaintiff or defendant or witness or observer. The courtroom itself was smaller than Ray had imagined, maybe 60 feet by 40 feet, with pews for spectators and a raised bench for the judge and a jury box that would hold 12 people who would decide whether saving seed was farming or fraud. The walls were wood-paneled and the lighting was fluorescent, and the whole space felt more like a conference room than a place where justice happened. But Katherine assured him that federal courtrooms were deliberately understated to prevent drama from overwhelming evidence. Judge Robert Chen entered at 9 precisely, a bailiff announcing his arrival with the instruction that all should rise. Chen was 68 years old, appointed to the federal bench in 2003, known among attorneys for patience with plaintiffs and intolerance for procedural gamesmanship. He was the son of Chinese immigrants who had farmed in California before moving to Nebraska in the 1960s, a fact that Katherine considered fortunate because Chen understood agriculture in ways many federal judges did not. The judge took his seat and looked out at the assembled parties, with an expression that suggested he had read every page of the filings and understood exactly what was at stake. His first words set the tone for everything that would follow. This case presents questions about the intersection of patent law, agricultural practice, and corporate responsibility. The court expects all parties to present their evidence clearly and truthfully. I will not tolerate theatrics. I will not tolerate deception, and I will not tolerate wasting this jury's time. Are we clear? Both Katherine and Harrison Croft responded affirmatively. The jury selection process began immediately. 12 seats to be filled from a pool of 46 potential jurors called from across eastern Nebraska. Katherine asked questions designed to identify people with farming connections or small business experience. Croft asked questions designed to eliminate anyone who might harbor suspicion of large corporations or sympathy for struggling farmers. By noon, they had 12 jurors and 2 alternates, 8 men, 4 women, ages ranging from 27 to 63, 3 with direct farming experience, 2 who grew up in farm families, 7 with no agricultural background. Ray studied their faces during selection and tried to read whether they would understand what Jonas's seed saving meant or whether they would see only violation of contract terms printed in small font. Katherine's opening statement began at 1:30 after the lunch recess. She stood before the jury without notes, speaking with the measured cadence of someone presenting facts too important to rush. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about a simple question. When Raymond Holloway bought seed from Genesis AgroSciences, paid for it, planted it, harvested it, and saved some for the next season, was he farming or was he committing a crime? She paused and let the question sit in the air. For 72 years, 3 generations of the Holloway family saved seed. Raymond's grandfather Jonas began the practice in 1952. He taught Raymond's father. Raymond's father taught Raymond. This was not theft. This was agriculture. The practice of selecting your best crop and preserving it for future planting is older than patent law, older than corporations, older than this courthouse. Katherine walked to the plaintiff's table and picked up Jonas's leather ledger, holding it so the jury could see the worn cover and the pages yellowed with age. This ledger documents every season from 1952 to 2024. 72 years of careful observation, selection, and preservation. Jonas Holloway was not a thief. He was a farmer doing what good farmers do, protecting against bad years by saving the seeds that performed best in good years. She set the ledger on the rail in front of the jury box. Genesis AgroSciences wants you to believe Raymond Holloway violated their patent rights, but their own documents prove something different. They prove Genesis designed a system to extract money from farmers like Raymond through fraudulent DNA testing, deceptive contract terms, and systematic targeting of vulnerable family operations. This is not about protecting innovation. This is about destroying farms to meet revenue targets. Harrison Croft's opening statement was everything Katherine's was not. Polished, corporate, delivered with the absolute confidence of someone who had won 89% of the cases he had tried. He wore a suit that probably cost $3,000 and spoke in language designed to make complex patent law sound simple and obvious. The plaintiffs want you to believe this case is about farming tradition versus corporate greed. That is not what this case is about. This case is about contract law and intellectual property rights. When Mr. Holloway purchased Genesis seed in 2022, he agreed to specific terms. Those terms, clearly printed on his receipt, stated the seed was licensed for single-season use only. He signed. He agreed. And then he violated those terms. Croft displayed Ray's receipt on a screen visible to the jury, zooming in on the fine print at the bottom. Saving and replanting seed constitutes patent infringement. These words are not hidden. They are printed on every receipt. Mr. Holloway had the opportunity to read them. He chose not to. That choice does not excuse violation. The attorney moved to stand directly in front of the jury. Genesis AgroSciences invests billions of dollars developing seed varieties that help farmers produce more food with less land. Patent protection allows them to recover those investments. Without patents, there is no incentive to innovate. Without innovation, agriculture stagnates. The plaintiffs ask you to ignore law and contract in favor of sympathy. I ask you to uphold the rules that make innovation possible. Ray watched the jurors' faces as Croft spoke and could not read whether they were persuaded or skeptical. Two of the older jurors had farming backgrounds. They might understand that innovation built in laboratories was different than adaptation built over generations. The younger jurors with no agricultural experience might see only contract violation, terms agreed to and then broken. Katherine called Ray as the first witness on the afternoon of January 11th. He took the stand feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom, raised his right hand, swore to tell the truth, and sat in the wooden chair that generations of witnesses had occupied before him. Katherine approached with Jonas's ledger in her hands. "Mr. Holloway, what is this?" "My grandfather's seed ledger. He kept it from 1952 until he died in 2009. Every year is documented. What he planted, what he saved, what he learned." Katherine opened to a random page and asked Ray to read the entry. His voice carried across the courtroom, steady despite the anxiety sitting in his chest. March 1963. Planted saved seed from 1962 north 80 acres. Hybrid variety performed well in dry conditions. Saved 40 bushels best ears for future planting. This variety handles drought better than purchased seed. Will continue selection. What did your grandfather mean by selection? Ray looked at the jury and tried to explain in language that would make sense to people who had never farmed. He was choosing the plants that performed best and saving their seed. Over time, that created varieties adapted to our specific soil and climate. Better than anything you could buy because it was selected specifically for our farm over years of observation. And Genesis claims this practice violates their patents. Yes. Did you know saving seed was illegal when you did it? Ray shook his head. I knew it was farming. I knew it was what Jonas taught me. I knew it was what every farmer I know has done for as long as farming existed. I did not know Genesis had changed the rules until men in a white van showed up in my field collecting evidence to sue me. Katherine walked Ray through his purchase of Genesis seed in 2022, the absence of any verbal disclosure about single-season restrictions, the fine print added to receipts between 2021 and 2022, the lawsuit filed for $280,000. She established the timeline carefully, making clear that Ray had not deliberately violated known terms, but had continued a practice that had been legal his entire life, and was suddenly called criminal without clear notice. The cross-examination began at 3:15. Harrison Croft approached the witness stand with the controlled aggression of a prosecutor who has found vulnerability and intends to exploit it. His first question was designed to undermine everything Ray had just established. "Mr. Holloway, you were arrested for driving under the influence in November 2019, were you not?" Katherine objected immediately. "Relevance, Your Honor. A DUI from 5 years ago has no bearing on whether Genesis committed fraud." Judge Chen considered for a moment. "I will allow limited inquiry into credibility, but counsel should connect this to the issues before us quickly." Croft turned back to Ray. "You were convicted of drunk driving. You paid a fine. Your license was suspended, correct?" "Yes." Ray's voice was quiet but steady. 3 days after I buried my wife." Croft paused, perhaps not expecting Ray to provide context. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Holloway, please elaborate." "My wife Anna died of cancer on October 30th, 2019. We buried her November 2nd. On November 3rd, I went to the cemetery and sat at her grave for 4 hours. I drove home. I should not have been driving. A sheriff's deputy pulled me over. I pleaded guilty. I paid the fine. I have not had a drink since that day." The courtroom was silent. 2 of the jurors were visibly moved. Croft shifted his approach. "Mr. Holloway, you claim you did not read the licensing terms on your receipt, but you run a farming operation. You handle contracts and documents regularly. Are you asking this jury to believe you never read the terms you agreed to?" Ray looked directly at Croft. "I am asking this jury to understand that when a farmer buys seed, he expects to be buying seed, not entering a legal framework where saving some for next year makes him a criminal. The receipt from 2021 had no restrictions. The receipt from 2022 added them in 6-point font. No one explained the change. No one told me the rules were different. I bought seed the way I had bought seed for 30 years. But you signed the receipt." "I signed a receipt acknowledging I received seed I paid for. I did not sign away the right to farm the way my grandfather farmed." The cross-examination continued for 90 more minutes, Croft trying to establish that Ray should have known better, should have read more carefully, should have understood that patent law had changed agricultural practice. Ray held firm, answering each question with the same core truth. He had farmed the way farmers farm, and Genesis had called it infringement without making clear that the rules had changed. When Ray stepped down from the witness stand at 5 that evening, he felt exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with physical labor. Katherine told him he had done well, that the jury had seen an honest man trying to explain honest practice, that Croft's attack on his DUI had backfired by making the circumstances sympathetic rather than damaging. But Ray could not shake the feeling that 12 strangers now held his future in their hands, and he had no way to know whether his words had been enough. Emma testified on January 12th about her research into Genesis's targeting practices, walking the jury through the spreadsheet David Kurtz had provided showing farms ranked by vulnerability. She explained how Genesis had identified multi-generational operations with financial stress indicators and moved them to high-priority enforcement. The jury watched the spreadsheet on the screen, seeing Ray's farm listed as row 7, priority ranking 5, notes about recent widow and equipment loan exposure. One juror, a woman in her 50s who ran a small business in Lincoln, asked a question during a break in testimony. "Ms. Holloway, you are saying Genesis specifically chose farms they thought would settle rather than fight?" Emma nodded. "That is exactly what I am saying. They were not enforcing patents randomly. They were targeting farmers least able to resist." Dr. Elena Vasquez took the stand on January 13th, and the atmosphere in the courtroom changed immediately. She was sworn in wearing professional clothes that could not quite hide the nervousness underneath, her hands shaking slightly as she took her seat. Katherine approached gently, knowing that everything depended on this testimony being credible and clear. "Dr. Vasquez, what is your educational background?" PhD in molecular genetics from Stanford. 8 years at Genesis AgroSciences as lead geneticist in their testing laboratory. "And what was your role at Genesis?" "I analyzed DNA samples collected from farmer fields to determine whether Genesis genetic markers were present. If markers were detected, I classified samples as infringement or non-infringement." Katherine pulled up the analysis Dr. Vasquez had performed on Ray's saved seed. "Can you explain what this shows?" Dr. Vasquez leaned forward, her voice gaining strength as she moved into technical explanation. Mr. Holloway's seed shares approximately 68% genetic similarity with Genesis GS4477 variety. Industry standard for patent infringement is 90% or higher similarity. His seed falls well below that threshold. So his seed was not Genesis seed. Scientifically, no. Over 70 years of natural mutation and selective breeding, the Holloway family created a distinct variety adapted to their specific growing conditions. The genetics diverged significantly from the original Genesis patent. But you classified it as infringement anyway. Dr. Vasquez's eyes filled. Yes, because Dr. Marcus Webb, the CEO, instructed me to use a 40% similarity threshold instead of the 90% industry standard. At 40%, almost any seed that had ever been in contact with Genesis genetics would test positive. Why would Dr. Webb want a lower threshold? Because it generated more lawsuits. More lawsuits meant more settlements. More settlements meant more revenue. I objected. I showed him the data proving Ray Holloway's seed was scientifically distinct. He told me classification was a business decision, not a scientific one. The courtroom absorbed this information in absolute silence. Katherine let it settle before asking the next question. Dr. Vasquez, how many other farmers' samples showed the same pattern? Genetically distinct seed classified as infringement on Dr. Webb's orders. I analyzed 214 samples over 3 years. All showed significant genetic divergence from Genesis patents. All were classified as infringement because Dr. Webb required it. Harrison Croft's cross-examination was brutal. He attacked Dr. Vasquez's credibility, suggested she was a disgruntled employee seeking revenge, implied her analysis was flawed or biased. But Dr. Vasquez held firm, citing peer-reviewed science and industry standards and the documented emails where Webb had ordered her to suppress results that did not support enforcement. The jury watched her testimony with focused attention. When she stepped down after 3 hours of examination, several jurors were taking extensive notes. One juror, an engineer from Omaha, was shaking his head slowly as if he had just witnessed something that violated his understanding of how companies should operate. David Kurtz testified on January 14th about his training as a field inspector, the quota systems, the bonuses for high enforcement numbers, the targeting lists that prioritized vulnerable farms. He brought training manuals marked confidential and read sections aloud that taught inspectors to time collections during financial stress periods and to present lawsuits as inevitable regardless of whether testing was definitive. Katherine asked the question that crystallized everything. Mr. Kurtz, in your 3 years as an inspector, did you ever encounter a farmer who knew that saving seed had become illegal? David shook his head. Not one. Every farmer I tested thought they were doing normal farming. When I told them they were violating patents, they were shocked, and I was trained to use that shock to pressure settlement. Emma presented Marcus Webb's compensation structure on January 15th, walking the jury through SEC filings that showed his base salary of $400,000 plus bonuses tied directly to seed compliance revenue. She displayed the calculation showing Webb had made $4.7 million in 2023 from a division that sued farmers. One juror, a farmer from outside Omaha, looked physically ill when he saw the number. $4.7 million from suing farmers, he said quietly to the juror next to him, not realizing his voice carried in the silent courtroom. Genesis's defense began on January 16th with Harrison Croft calling expert witnesses to testify about patent law, intellectual property rights, and the necessity of enforcement to protect innovation. The witnesses were credible and professional, and spoken language that made Genesis's position sound reasonable if you did not think too hard about what it meant for farmers who had saved seed for generations. But the defense could not overcome the evidence Katherine had presented. The recordings of Webb talking about destroying farms, the emails showing DNA testing manipulation, the training manuals teaching systematic exploitation, the compensation structure proving profit motive. On January 18th, Marcus Webb himself took the stand. He was 62 years old, expensively dressed, radiating the particular arrogance of someone who has spent a career winning and does not believe losing is possible. Croft walked him through his credentials, his experience, his philosophy about protecting innovation through rigorous patent enforcement. Katherine's cross-examination began gently, almost conversationally. "Dr. Webb, how much did you personally earn from the Seed Compliance Division in 2023? Webb hesitated just long enough to suggest he did not want to answer. $4.7 million including bonuses. And those bonuses were calculated as a percentage of Compliance Division revenue. Yes, 2%. So when farmers like Raymond Holloway were sued for $280,000, you personally profited. Webb's expression hardened. I was compensated for building a successful division that protected Genesis intellectual property. Katherine pulled up the recording of Webb's voice from the executive meeting. Let me play something for the jury. Webb's recorded voice filled the courtroom. Small farms are fundamentally inefficient. They tie up land that could be consolidated. Our enforcement program accelerates this natural market evolution. We identify farms on thin margins and create pressure that forces sale. Katherine stopped the playback. Dr. Webb, does that sound like protecting innovation or destroying farms for profit? Webb's face flushed. That was a strategic discussion taken out of context. What context makes it acceptable to target vulnerable farmers specifically? Because they cannot afford to fight. It is business strategy. Enforcement priorities must be established. Katherine pulled up the email where Webb had told Dr. Vasquez to classify genetically distinct seed as infringement. You ordered your geneticist to use a 40% similarity threshold when industry standard is 90%. Why? To ensure comprehensive enforcement. Or to ensure more lawsuits generated more revenue for your bonuses. Croft objected, argumentative. Judge Chen sustained, but the damage was done. The jury had heard Webb admit to profiting from lawsuits, to targeting farms strategically, to overriding scientific analysis for business reasons. His arrogance on the stand had transformed him from corporate executive protecting property into something uglier. A man who had made millions by destroying families who committed no crime except farming. The testimony concluded on January 21st. Judge Chen scheduled closing arguments for January 24th after giving both sides time to prepare. Ray spent those 3 days in a state of controlled anxiety, unable to focus on anything except the approaching moment when a jury would decide his future. On the evening of January 23rd, Katherine called with news that broke something Ray had been holding together through sheer force of will. Frank Dietrich had died that afternoon at Kearney Regional Medical Center. His heart, damaged by the stress of facing a $340,000 lawsuit for saving seed, had finally given out. Martha was with him at the end. He died knowing the trial was happening but not knowing whether it would matter. Ray sat in his kitchen with the phone in his hand and let the tears come. Frank had been his neighbor for 22 years, a steady presence and reliable friend, a man who had served his country in Vietnam and come home to farm honestly and raise a family and hurt no one. And Genesis AgroSciences had killed him as surely as if they had put a gun to his head, because the stress of their fraudulent lawsuit had stopped his heart. The funeral was scheduled for January 26th, after closing arguments but before verdict. Ray would speak because Martha had asked him to, and because saying no would have been impossible. But first there was January 24th, and Katherine's closing argument, and the final chance to make 12 strangers understand why this mattered. Katherine stood before the jury at 9 on the morning of January 24th, and spoke for 90 minutes without notes or theatrical gestures or anything, except the accumulated weight of evidence she had presented over 2 weeks. Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard testimony from geneticists and executives and farmers and inspectors. You have seen documents proving systematic fraud. You have heard recordings of Dr. Webb admitting he designed enforcement to destroy farms. You have seen emails showing DNA testing was manipulated to generate lawsuits. You have learned that a man made $4.7 million by suing farmers for practicing agriculture the way it has been practiced for generations. She walked to the plaintiff's table and picked up Jonas's ledger one final time. This ledger represents 72 years of honest farming. Jonas Holloway saving seed through the Depression, the Dust Bowl, every crisis, teaching his grandson that good farmers preserve the best of what they grow. Raymond Holloway continued that practice, not knowing that Genesis had criminalized it in 6-point font without clear disclosure. Katherine set the ledger back down and faced the jury directly. Genesis will tell you this is about contract law and patent protection, but contracts require informed consent. Patents protect innovation, not fraud. What Genesis did was design a system to extract maximum profit from vulnerable farmers through deceptive practices, manipulated science, and systematic targeting. They did not protect innovation. They destroyed families. She paused, and her voice dropped to something quieter but harder. Frank Dietrich died yesterday. Heart attack brought on by the stress of defending against a lawsuit based on fraud. He was 63 years old. He served his country. He farmed honestly his entire life. Genesis killed him to meet revenue targets that paid executive bonuses. 2 jurors were crying openly. Katherine pressed forward. You have the power to tell Genesis that farming is not fraud, that saving seed is not theft, that destroying families for profit will not be tolerated. Raymond Holloway and 31 other farmers ask you to declare that they committed no crime except believing that when you buy seed and pay for it and grow it, you own what you grow. Please give them that justice. Harrison Croft's closing argument was competent and professional, and utterly unable to overcome the weight of evidence against him. He argued contract law and patent protection, and the necessity of enforcement, but his words landed in a courtroom that had heard Marcus Webb's arrogance and Dr. Vasquez's testimony, and the recordings proving systematic fraud. Legal theory could not erase documented corruption. The jury received instructions from Judge Chen at noon and retired to deliberate. Ray sat in the hallway outside the courtroom with Emma and Katherine, and 20 of the 32 plaintiffs who had driven to Omaha to be present for the verdict. They waited with the particular anxiety of people whose entire futures depend on decisions being made in a room they cannot enter. The hours passed with agonizing slowness. 1 in the afternoon became 3, became 5. Katherine explained that longer deliberation was not necessarily bad, that it meant jurors were taking their responsibility seriously, examining evidence carefully, discussing rather than rushing to judgment. At 6:47, the bailiff emerged and announced the jury had reached a verdict. They would reconvene at 7 to hear it read. Ray's heart began racing in a way that reminded him of Frank's heart attack, stress manifesting as physical symptoms that were impossible to ignore. The courtroom filled quickly. Ray took his seat at the plaintiff's table between Emma and Katherine, his hands folded in front of him to keep them from shaking. The jury filed in with expressions that revealed nothing. Judge Chen entered and called the court to order. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman was a 61-year-old farmer from outside Omaha who had spent 2 weeks listening to every word of testimony. He stood and spoke in a voice that carried across the courtroom with the authority of someone delivering not just a decision but a judgment. "We have, Your Honor." The clerk took the written verdict from the foreman and handed it to Judge Chen. The judge read it silently, his expression unchanging, then handed it back to be read aloud. In the matter of Holloway versus Genesis AgroSciences, on the count of fraudulent business practices, we find for the plaintiffs. Ray felt Emma grab his hand. Katherine placed her hand on his shoulder. The clerk continued reading. On the count of deceptive trade practices, we find for the plaintiffs. On the count of breach of contract, we find for the plaintiffs. On the count of intentional infliction of emotional distress, we find for the plaintiffs. The courtroom erupted in applause, and Judge Chen allowed it for exactly 10 seconds before gaveling for order. The clerk continued with the damages awarded. Compensatory damages, $47 million divided equally among plaintiffs. Punitive damages, $80 million for systematic and intentional harm. Total judgment, $127 million. The jury foreman was not finished. He cleared his throat and spoke directly to the plaintiffs. "Your Honor, the jury requests permission to make a statement." Judge Chen nodded. "You may proceed." "We want the plaintiffs to know we did not reach this decision lightly. We reviewed every piece of evidence. We listened to every witness. And we concluded that what Genesis AgroSciences did was not business, it was fraud. Farmers who save seed are not criminals. They are farmers. And Genesis owes them not just money but an apology this court cannot order but decency demands." The courtroom stood and applauded, and Judge Chen did not gavel them down this time. He simply let the moment exist, let the farmers who had fought and won have the acknowledgement they had earned. When silence finally returned, the judge spoke his own words. "This court will enter judgment for the plaintiffs in the amount of $127 million. Additionally, the court issues permanent injunction preventing Genesis AgroSciences from enforcing seed compliance claims based on the DNA testing methodology proven fraudulent in this trial. All pending lawsuits against farmers are hereby dismissed with prejudice." Ray sat in the courtroom that had just declared him right and felt tears streaming down his face that he made no effort to hide. Emma was crying. Katherine was crying. Farmers throughout the courtroom were embracing each other and wiping eyes and looking like people who had carried impossible weight and were finally allowed to set it down. But even in the moment of victory, Ray thought about Frank Dietrich, who had died not knowing this would happen, about Carl Dietrich, who had died believing he was a thief, about all the farmers who had settled quietly and would never know their shame was undeserved. The victory was real. The judgment was won. But the cost was higher than money could measure, and some things broken could not be made whole even by the most righteous verdict a jury could deliver. Frank Dietrich's funeral took place on January 26, 2025, at the First Lutheran Church in Kearney, under a sky the color of old pewter that threatened snow, but never quite delivered it. The church was built in 1947, white clapboard with a steeple that rose maybe 60 feet into the January cold, the kind of building that had witnessed 3 generations of farmers being married and baptized and buried within its walls. The parking lot overflowed with trucks and cars, forcing latecomers to park along the street for 2 blocks in either direction. Inside, every pew was filled. Martha Dietrich sat in the front row flanked by her 2 daughters, all three women wearing black and carrying the particular exhaustion that comes from grief that has been building for months and finally arrived. Frank's casket sat at the front of the church, closed, draped with an American flag in recognition of his service in Vietnam. Photographs on easels showed Frank at different ages, young in uniform, middle-aged on a tractor, recent standing beside Martha at their 40th wedding anniversary. Ray sat 3 rows back with Emma and Dutch and Maria Santos, and most of the 32 farmers who had been plaintiffs in the lawsuit. Katherine Porter was there. David Kurtz sat in the back, looking like a man attending a funeral for someone he had helped kill. Dr. Elena Vasquez sat alone near the middle, her presence a quiet acknowledgement that she understood the cost of the fraud she had helped expose. The pastor spoke about Frank's life, his service, his devotion to family and farm and community. He spoke about sacrifice and honor, and the particular courage it takes to stand up when standing up might cost everything. He did not mention Genesis AgroSciences by name, but everyone in the church understood what had killed Frank Dietrich, understood that the stress of defending against a fraudulent lawsuit had stopped a heart that had survived 2 tours in Vietnam and 49 years of Nebraska weather. Martha asked Ray to speak. He walked to the front of the church feeling the weight of every eye on him, stood at the lectern, and looked out at faces he had known for decades. His voice when he spoke was quiet but carried in the silence. Frank and I were neighbors for 22 years. He taught me things about farming that books do not teach. How to read weather, how to fix equipment with whatever you have on hand, how to keep going when the year is bad and the bank is calling and quitting looks easier than continuing. Ray paused and the church waited. 3 months ago, Frank got sued by Genesis AgroSciences for $340,000. They claimed he committed patent infringement by saving seed his father had taught him to save. The lawsuit was based on fraudulent DNA testing and systematic targeting of vulnerable farms. Frank knew it was wrong. He joined our class action. He fought. The words caught in Ray's throat for a moment before he could continue. 2 days ago, a jury declared that Frank committed no crime, that saving seed is farming, not theft, that Genesis owed us justice. Frank died before he could hear that verdict. But I want everyone here to know that his fight mattered. Without Frank standing up, without every farmer in this church standing up, Genesis would still be destroying families to meet revenue targets. Ray looked at Martha in the front pew. Frank served his country in Vietnam. He came home and served his community by farming honestly and raising a family and being the kind of neighbor who shows up when you need help. He died defending the right to farm the way farmers have always farmed. That is service. That is honor. And I will spend the rest of my life making sure people remember what it cost him. He walked back to his seat through silence, so complete it felt like the church itself was holding its breath. The service continued with hymns and prayers and the particular rituals of Lutheran funerals, but Ray heard very little of it. He sat and thought about Frank in a hospital bed, saying he was scared not of dying, but of Martha having to fight alone. Frank had fought as long as his heart allowed, and then his heart had given out, and now Martha was alone anyway, and no verdict could change that. The burial took place at Kearney Cemetery under the pewter sky that finally began dropping snow as the pastor spoke the committal. Frank was laid to rest next to his parents, his grandfather, generations of Dietrichs who had farmed the same land and passed it to their children, and never imagined that a corporation would someday claim ownership of seeds older than patents. The flag was folded and presented to Martha with words about gratitude for Frank's service. 21 rifles fired 3 volleys into the January air. And then it was finished, except for the gathering at the church basement where neighbors brought casseroles and told stories and tried to fill the space Frank's absence created. Ray stayed long enough to pay respects to Martha, to tell her that Genesis would pay Frank's share of the settlement to her directly, that the lawsuit against Frank was dismissed, and his name cleared of any wrongdoing. Martha nodded and thanked him and looked like a woman who understood that vindication did not resurrect the dead. Driving back to the farm with Emma in the passenger seat, Ray watched the snow fall across harvested fields and felt the particular emptiness that follows funerals. Frank was gone. Carl Dietrich was gone. The victory was real, but the cost was measured in lives ended, and families broken and futures that would never arrive. No amount of money could balance that equation. Emma spoke quietly. Dad, Frank knew what the fight was about. He chose to join it knowing the stress might kill him. That was his choice. You did not force him. Ray knew she was right, but knowing did not make the guilt lighter. I should have settled, taken whatever Genesis offered. If I had settled in October, Frank would still be alive. If you had settled, 46 other farmers would still be facing fraudulent lawsuits. Frank would tell you he made the right choice. He would tell you winning mattered more than one more year of life. Ray nodded but said nothing. The snow continued falling, covering the black soil with white that would melt in a few days or weeks and leave the ground ready for spring planting. Everything in farming was cycles: plant and harvest, life and death, victory and cost. The cycles turned regardless of whether anyone wanted them to stop. Genesis AgroSciences filed notice of appeal on February 3rd, claiming the verdict was excessive and unsupported by evidence. Their legal team argued that Judge Chen had erred in allowing testimony about executive compensation and enforcement targeting, that the jury had been prejudiced by emotional appeals rather than focused on contract law. They asked the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals to overturn the verdict and order a new trial. Katherine filed response briefs that methodically dismantled every argument. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury was properly instructed. The verdict was supported by documented fraud spanning 3 years and affecting hundreds of farmers. On March 8th, a 3-judge panel of the Eighth Circuit denied Genesis's appeal in a written opinion that was remarkable for its bluntness. The district court's findings are amply supported by evidence of systematic fraud. Genesis AgroSciences designed and implemented a seed compliance program specifically to extract money from vulnerable farmers through deceptive DNA testing, manipulated contract terms, and targeting of families least able to resist. The jury's verdict reflects appropriate recognition of the harm caused. Appeal denied. The decision was final. No further appeals were available. Genesis owed $127 million to 32 Nebraska farmers, divided equally, $3,968,750 each. Ray's share would pay off every debt he carried, fund equipment replacement for the next decade, and leave enough in the bank to weather any crisis farming could throw at him. But the money was not what mattered most. What mattered was the permanent injunction preventing Genesis from enforcing seed compliance claims based on fraudulent testing. What mattered was all pending lawsuits dismissed. What mattered was farmers across the country learning that saving seed was not criminal and that corporations could not rewrite agricultural practice through fine print and fraud. The Nebraska legislature introduced LB 447 on February 12th. Formally titled the Agricultural Heritage Protection Act, but known universally as Carl's Law in memory of Carl Dietrich, who had died believing seed saving made him a thief. The bill was sponsored by State Senator Patricia Donovan from the Agricultural Committee, co-sponsored by 17 other senators representing rural districts that understood what was at stake. The text of the bill was simple and direct. Seed saving for personal agricultural use on land owned or operated by the farmer could not constitute patent infringement under Nebraska law. DNA testing for patent enforcement required independent laboratory verification and informed written consent from the farmer. Seed companies must disclose all licensing restrictions in typeface, no smaller than 12 point on the front of all purchase documentation. And the state would create a $10 million fund to assist farmers facing corporate agricultural lawsuits. Ray attended the committee hearings in Lincoln alongside Maria Santos, who testified about losing her husband Carlos in 2019 and nearly losing the farm to Genesis's lawsuit. Her testimony was powerful and personal, describing what it meant to face bankruptcy for continuing a practice her late husband had learned from his father. After the hearing, Maria introduced Ray to her son Michael, a hydrologist working on aquifer conservation projects across Nebraska. The young man was thoughtful and asked intelligent questions about seed genetics and soil adaptation, showing the kind of mind that understood how natural systems worked. Ray noticed Emma talking with Michael after the hearing, the two of them deep in conversation about environmental law and agricultural policy. The bill passed the legislature on March 4th with 44 votes in favor, 3 against, 2 abstentions. Governor Patricia Chen signed it into law on March 11th at a ceremony held at the state capitol with farmers and agricultural advocates filling the rotunda. She spoke about Frank Dietrich and Carl Dietrich and the 47 farmers who had fought Genesis, about the importance of protecting agricultural heritage and family farms and practices that predated corporate patents. Ray stood behind the governor during the signing, watching her put pen to paper and transform their fight into state law that would protect every farmer who came after. Emma stood beside him. Dutch was there, Maria Santos, David Kurtz, Dr. Elena Vasquez, Katherine Porter, all of them witnesses to the moment when loss became legacy and suffering became protection for others. After the ceremony, reporters asked Ray how it felt to have legislation named for his fight. He looked at the cameras and the microphones and the crowd of farmers who had driven to Lincoln to see this happen, and said the only thing that felt true. This law exists because Carl Dietrich and Frank Dietrich died fighting fraud that should never have happened. I wish they were here to see it. I wish this law was not necessary. But since it is necessary, I am grateful it will protect farmers from what we went through. By late March, the industry changes that Genesis's defeat had triggered were becoming visible across agricultural markets. Case IH issued new seed licensing terms with restrictions printed in 14-point font on the front of every bag, with verbal disclosure required at point of sale. AGCO published policy changes eliminating remote enforcement and requiring court orders before any compliance action could be initiated. Genesis AgroSciences announced suspension of their seed compliance division, pending review of testing methodologies and targeting practices. Marcus Webb resigned as CEO of Genesis AgroSciences on March 18th. The company's board issued a statement thanking him for his service, while simultaneously announcing a complete restructuring of seed compliance operations. Genesis's stock price had fallen 41% since the verdict. 3 separate class action securities lawsuits had been filed by shareholders claiming the company had concealed fraud and misrepresented compliance revenue. The Securities and Exchange Commission had opened an investigation into whether Genesis executives had engaged in securities fraud by failing to disclose systematic targeting of farmers. Emma and David Kurtz announced the formation of Seed Freedom Legal Clinic on March 20th, a non-profit organization dedicated to helping farmers fight corporate agricultural lawsuits. Emma would serve as executive director. David would manage field operations, using his knowledge of enforcement tactics to help farmers document and defend against similar programs at other companies. Dr. Elena Vasquez joined as scientific advisor, providing expertise on DNA testing methodologies and industry standards. The clinic opened with funding from 5% of each plaintiff's settlement payment, creating an operating budget of $6,300,000 that would sustain operations for years. Their first cases came from Iowa and South Dakota and Minnesota, farmers who had received threat letters from biotech companies claiming patent infringement for seed saving. Emma and David reviewed each case, identified patterns of fraud or deception, and provided legal support that leveled playing fields that had been tilted toward corporations. Dr. Vasquez published a peer-reviewed paper in the Journal of Agricultural Genetics in April titled Genetic Diversity Through Traditional Seed Saving: Empirical Evidence of Farmer-Created Varieties. The paper analyzed the 214 DNA samples she had tested at Genesis, demonstrating that 72% showed significant genetic divergence from original patents through natural mutation and selective breeding. She argued that farmer seed saving created agricultural biodiversity that corporate monoculture could not replicate, that the practice should be protected as essential to food security and climate adaptation. The paper was downloaded 40,000 times in the first month. Agricultural scientists cited it in testimony before Congress. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization referenced it in a report on seed sovereignty and farmer rights. Dr. Vasquez became a sought-after speaker at conferences about agricultural policy, intellectual property reform, and the intersection of corporate power and food systems. April arrived in Nebraska with the particular urgency that spring brings to farm country. The ground thawed, the soil tested ready, and Ray Holloway stood in the machine shed looking at 200 bushels of saved seed that he was now legally permitted to plant without fear of lawsuit or enforcement or men in white vans collecting evidence of farming. The seed sat in labeled containers, sorted by the quality Jonas had taught him to recognize. Best ears from highest yielding sections. Genetics selected over 70 years to handle Nebraska soil and climate and the particular challenges of farming 640 acres with conservative equipment budgets, and whether that did not care about human planning. Emma found him there on April 15th standing among the seed bins, with Jonas's leather ledger open in his hands. She had driven down from Omaha for the day, bringing news she wanted to deliver in person. Ray looked up when she entered and saw something in her expression that made him set the ledger aside. "Dad, I need to tell you something." Emma's voice carried nervousness and excitement in equal measure. "I am pregnant, due in December, and Michael Santos and I are together. We have been dating since the Carl's Law hearings in February." Ray felt surprise give way to understanding. He remembered seeing Emma and Michael talking after Maria's testimony, the way they had stood close together discussing environmental policy with the particular intensity of people discovering shared interests. Michael Santos, Maria's son, the hydrologist Ray had met briefly at the hearing, a young man who understood water and soil and the natural systems that sustained farming. "We want to build a life here in Nebraska," Emma continued. "Michael has accepted a position with the State Department of Natural Resources. We are looking for a house in Kearney, close enough to visit, close enough to help with the farm if you need it." "And the baby?" Emma's smile widened. "If it is a girl, we want to name her Anna, after Mom. If it is a boy, Jonas, after your grandfather. Either way, they will grow up knowing where they came from." Ray felt his eyes fill and did not try to hide it. He pulled Emma into an embrace that acknowledged everything they had survived together, everything that was coming. When they separated, Ray's voice was thick with emotion. "Michael is a good man. I saw that when I met him in Lincoln. Maria raised him right, and if he makes you happy, then I am happy." Emma wiped her eyes. "He asked me to marry him last week. I said yes. We are thinking a small ceremony this summer, just family and close friends." Ray nodded, feeling the weight of Anna's absence in this moment that she should have been present for. "Your mother would have loved him. She would have loved knowing the farm continues, that our grandchild will carry her name or Jonas's name. They spent the afternoon walking the farm, Ray showing Emma the fields where the saved seed had been planted, the barn where Jonas had taught him selection, the machine shed where 3 generations of equipment sat waiting for the next season's work. Emma walked with her hand occasionally resting on her still flat stomach, already imagining the child who would someday walk these same paths and learn these same lessons. That night Ray sat at the kitchen table and established the Frank Dietrich Seed Heritage Fund with a donation of $500,000 from his settlement. The fund would provide grants to farmers seeking to preserve heirloom seed varieties, support research into farmer-managed breeding programs, and offer legal assistance to anyone facing corporate pressure to abandon seed-saving practices. Emma agreed to serve as board president. Maria Santos agreed to serve as secretary. Dutch McKenna agreed to serve as treasurer. The first grants were awarded in May to 7 farmers across Nebraska and Iowa who were maintaining seed varieties their families had preserved for multiple generations. A farmer in Iowa received funding to document and propagate a corn variety his grandfather had developed in the 1940s. A farmer in South Dakota received support for preserving wheat genetics that had survived the Dust Bowl. Each grant came with the requirement that recipients document their work and share seed with other farmers who wanted to continue the varieties. May 15th arrived with perfect planting conditions. The soil was warm and dry enough to work. The forecast promised a week without rain. Ray climbed into his tractor at 6 in the morning and began planting the seed he had saved from Jonas's varieties, the genetics that had been called infringement and were now vindicated as distinct and valuable, and his to use without restriction. The planter moved through the field laying seed in rows that would become corn in July and be harvested in October, and provide the next generation of saved seed if the practice continued as it should. Ray worked through the morning and into the afternoon, stopping only for water and to check the planter mechanism. The rhythm of the work settled into his bones the way it always did, the particular satisfaction of putting seed in ground and trusting it to grow. At 3 in the afternoon, he stopped the tractor in the middle of the North 80 and sat looking at the field Jonas had bought in 1952. The same soil, the same sky, the same work that had sustained 3 generations and would sustain a 4th if the promises made were kept. Ray thought about Anna and the vow he had made to keep farming. He thought about Frank, who died defending the right to farm honestly. He thought about Carl, who died believing he was a thief, when really he was a farmer doing what farmers do. The phone in his pocket rang with Katherine Porter's number. He answered, and her voice came through with professional satisfaction. "Ray, I wanted you to know that Genesis filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection this morning. The settlement payments, the legal fees, the loss of seed compliance revenue, and the pending securities lawsuits pushed them into insolvency. The company is being restructured. Marcus Webb is facing criminal charges for securities fraud. It is over." Ray absorbed the news without the triumph he might have expected to feel. Genesis bankrupt meant jobs lost, employees affected, ripple effects through agricultural markets that would hurt people who had nothing to do with fraud. But it also meant accountability, consequences for building profit centers on deception, proof that corporations could not destroy families without eventually facing justice. "Thank you for telling me, Katherine, and thank you for everything you did to make this happen." "You made it happen, Ray. You kept records. You asked for help. You refused to settle quietly. Every farmer who joins our fight from now on will have your case as precedent, proving that documentation and truth can defeat corporate fraud." After the call ended, Ray sat in the tractor cab and spoke to Anna's memory one more time. "We did it, Anna. The farm is safe. Emma is coming back to Nebraska with a good man. They are having a baby they will name after you or Jonas. Frank and Carl did not live to see it, but their deaths meant something. The law changed. The industry changed. And farmers can save seed again without being called criminals. The voice in his head that sounded like Anna said what she would have said. Then stop sitting in that tractor and finish planting. The seed will not put itself in the ground. Ray smiled and started the engine and went back to work, planting row after row until the sun dropped toward the western horizon, and the light turned gold and horizontal across the Nebraska prairie. When he finally finished at 7 that evening, 240 acres were planted with seed that was legally his, genetically distinct, adapted through 70 years of selection to this specific piece of ground. He drove the tractor back to the machine shed and shut down the engine and sat in the silence that followed, the particular quiet that exists at the end of a day's work when the task is complete, and tomorrow will bring new tasks, but tonight there is nothing left except rest. Through the shed door he could see the farmhouse where Anna had lived and died, where Emma had grown up, where a granddaughter or grandson would someday visit and learn stories about the people who came before. Ray climbed down from the tractor and walked to the house through evening light that made the white siding look golden. Inside, he made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and opened Jonas's leather ledger to the last page. In his grandfather's handwriting was the final entry, dated March 2009. 72 years of seed saving. Through depression, dust bowl, drought, flood, every crisis, the practice sustained us. May it sustain whoever comes after. Save your best seed. Document everything. The truth you preserve is the truth that survives. Ray took a pen and added his own entry beneath Jonas's final words. April 2025. Planted saved seed legally after fighting Genesis AgroSciences for fraudulent patent enforcement. One verdict protecting farmer rights. Lost Frank Dietrich and Carl Dietrich in the fight. Emma returning to Nebraska with Michael Santos. Baby due December will carry Anna or Jonah's name. The farm continues. The practice continues. The truth documented has survived. He closed the ledger and sat with it on the table. This record of 3 generations learning and preserving and passing forward knowledge that corporations had tried to claim as property. Tomorrow he would take the ledger to the bank in Kearney and place it in a safe deposit box alongside the seeds he was preserving for next season. Documentation and genetics together, protected and available for whoever came after. But tonight he sat in the kitchen where so many decisions had been made, where Anna had told him to keep farming, where Emma had quit her job to help him fight, where the shape of their victory had slowly assembled itself from evidence and testimony, and the refusal to accept that farming made farmers criminals. Outside the window, darkness settled over 640 acres of Nebraska farmland. Seed lay in the ground waiting to germinate. Weather would come, good or bad, and the crop would respond as crops do, growing or struggling based on rain and sun, and all the variables no farmer could control. But the practice would continue. The documentation would preserve. And the truth that seed saving was agriculture, not infringement, would stand as precedent for every farmer who came after. Ray stood and walked to the window and looked out at the farm that had survived 72 years and would survive 72 more if the promises were kept. He thought about Jonas buying this ground in 1952 with money saved through the Depression. He thought about Anna making him promise to keep it. He thought about Emma bringing new life back to this land. He thought about Frank and Carl who died so others could farm freely. The cost had been high. The victory was real but incomplete because the dead stayed dead and no verdict resurrected them. But the fight had mattered. The documentation had worked. The truth had survived. And that would have to be enough because in farming, like in life, you work with what the season gives you and trust that good seed properly saved will grow when conditions allow. Ray spoke one more time to Anna's memory, the ritual that had sustained him through 5 years of grief and struggle and eventual vindication. The farm is safe, Anna. The baby will carry your name. Emma is happy. We beat them. Jonas would be proud. The voice in his head that sounded like her did not answer this time, because sometimes silence is the only response that fits. The acknowledgement that some conversations end not because there is nothing left to say, but because everything that needed saying has been said, and what remains is simply living the life that was fought for and preserved. Ray turned off the kitchen light and walked through the darkened farmhouse to the bedroom he had shared with Anna. Tomorrow would bring new work. The clinic would help more farmers. The fund would preserve more seeds. The farm would continue through another season and another generation. But tonight there was only rest, and the satisfaction of promises kept, and the knowledge that when corporations tried to call farming fraud, farmers with documentation and determination, and the willingness to ask for help, could prove that the oldest practice in civilization was still the most essential. He closed his eyes and let sleep come, falling into darkness that was peaceful rather than troubled because the fight was finished, and the verdict was won, and the seeds were in the ground where they belonged, waiting to grow into crops that would feed families and preserve genetics and prove that what you save is what sustains you, generation after generation, as long as someone remembers to document the truth and plant the seed and keep the promises that matter most. The story that began with a white van in an October cornfield ended with seed in April soil, and a granddaughter coming in December who would carry her grandmother's name and learn her great-great-grandfather's wisdom that good farmers preserve the best of what they grow, document what they learn, and pass both forward to whoever comes after because the land endures and the practice continues and the truth, when properly saved and carefully tended, grows into harvests that feed more than just one season or one family or one generation. It grows into legacy, and legacy, Ray understood as sleep finally took him, was the only crop that mattered when everything else was tallied, and the final accounting was made of what a life had grown and what it left behind for the future to harvest.